Story 1. My girlfriend changed every night. Introduction. I didn't believe in bad energy. I didn't believe in omens or the way some people swore a place could feel wrong before anything happened. I believed in plumbing, in locks, in rent receipts, in the small math of monthly paychecks and what you can afford. If something went wrong, it had a cause. If you couldn't see the cause, you just hadn't found it yet. When Leah and I signed the lease, I told myself that was all there was to it, cause and effect. We were moving because our old place had been sold and the new owner wanted to renovate. We had 30 days. Leah's shifts at the pharmacy were getting longer. My contract work had finally stabilized, and we needed somewhere close enough to both of our jobs that we wouldn't spend our lives on trains. The listing for the apartment had been up less than a day when I saw it. 2 bedrooms, top floor, older building, not renovated to the point of looking sterile. The rent was lower than it should have been, which I noticed, but not so low it screamed scam. Just low enough to feel like luck. I remember the photos more than I remember the first visit. In the photos, the place looked too clean, like a staged apartment that no one had ever lived in. Pale walls, empty corners, a kitchen with cabinets that had been painted over but not badly, a bathroom tile pattern that belonged to another decade. The balcony photo had been taken at sunset. Someone had angled the shot so the sky looked warm and the street below looked sleepy. There was nothing in those pictures that suggested anything one way or another. Nothing that warned you. Nothing that could... The day we went to see it, it was raining lightly. The building sat on a narrow street with parked cars on both sides and a row of damp plane trees that made the pavement shine. It was one of those older blocks that had been patched and repatched over the years. New intercom, old stone entry, fresh paint on the lobby walls, but the stairs still worn shallow in the center from decades of feet. The landlord, a man named Marino, met us at the door. He had a folder tucked under his arm and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke trapped in fabric. His smile looked practiced, like he'd used it too many times that week. He talked fast, like he wanted the viewing to be over. He pointed out the good bones of the place, the double-paned windows, the high ceilings. He kept saying it was quiet, and I remember thinking that was just the kind of thing landlords said when they had nothing else. Leah was quieter than me during the tour. She ran her fingers over the kitchen counter, opened and closed drawers, watched the way the balcony door stuck slightly in its frame. She did those practical checks that always made me feel like she was the adult, and I was just enthusiastic. At one point, in the hallway between the bedrooms, Marino stopped and adjusted the light switch plate with his thumb, as if it bothered him that it wasn't straight. The light flickered once when it came on, then steadied. He laughed it off. "Old wiring," he said, and shrugged. I nodded because it sounded plausible. The apartment smelled like dust and something faintly metallic, like rain on old radiators. When Marino opened the windows, the smell thinned. I stood at the edge of the second bedroom and listened. There was the distant rush of cars, a dog barking somewhere, the muffled thud of someone closing a door 2 floors down. Nothing else. No voices through the walls, no music, no television murmurs. For a top-floor place, it really did seem quiet. "Do you know who lived here before?" Leah asked as we were stepping back into the hallway. Marino blinked, like the question surprised him. "An older woman," he said after a beat. "She moved to be closer to family. It's nothing. People come and go." He said it in a way that implied the conversation was over. Leah's eyebrows lifted slightly, and I gave her the smallest shrug I could manage without being obvious. Outside, we stood under the building's shallow awning and watched the rain bead on the sidewalk. Leah looked back at the dark windows above us. "It's nice," she said, but her voice had a careful flatness to it. "It's nice," I agreed, because on paper it was. We were out of time. The rent was right. The location was right. It wasn't perfect, but nothing is. "Do you feel okay about it?" She hesitated long enough that I noticed. Then she nodded. "Yeah, I think so." The paperwork happened quickly. Marino wanted the deposit in cash, which made me tense, but he did produce receipts and a printed lease and a copy of his ID. I told myself that was enough. When you're pressed, you accept enough more easily. We signed, counted out the money at our kitchen table in the old apartment, and 2 days later, Marino handed over a set of keys that were heavier than they needed to be, old-fashioned brass with the teeth worn smooth at the edges. Moving always makes you feel like your life is made of objects. Boxes, tape, the dull anxiety of carrying something upstairs without dropping it. Leah labeled everything in neat black marker. Kitchen, glasses, bedroom, linens, bathroom. I wrapped our plates in newspaper, and the ink came off on my hands. When you're physically exhausted, you stop listening to small doubts. Your body takes over and tells your brain to shut up and lift. The first night we slept in the new place, we didn't have curtains up yet. The streetlight outside cast a pale, rectangular glow across the bedroom floor. Leah fell asleep faster than I did. I lay on my back on the new mattress we'd dragged up the stairs, listening to the building settle. Old buildings make noises, pipes ticking as they cool, a soft creak as wood shifts, the distant hum of a refrigerator somewhere. It was all ordinary. Still, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying Marino's hurried tour, the way he'd said, an older woman, without giving a name, the way Leah's fingers had lingered on the balcony door frame, like she was feeling for something I couldn't see. At some point, Leah rolled over and pressed her forehead against my shoulder. Her hair smelled like shampoo and damp air from the rain. "You're tense," she murmured, half asleep. "It's just moving," I said. She made a small sound in her throat that could have been agreement. Then her breathing deepened again. I stayed awake long enough that I began to feel stupid. Here we were, in a decent apartment, in a city where decent apartments didn't come cheap, and I was inventing unease because my life had been disrupted and my body didn't like change. Eventually, sometime after midnight, my eyelids grew heavy and the sound of the street outside blurred into something like white noise. When I woke, it was early. The light through the bare windows was gray and cold. Leah was already up, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, looking down the hall toward the living room. She was barefoot, her shoulders slightly raised as if she'd been chilled. For a second, I thought she was listening for something. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. She turned toward me too quickly, like I'd caught her in the middle of a thought. "Nothing," she said. "I thought I heard the building." "The building?" She nodded, but it didn't look like a yes. It looked like a habit, a reflex. Just pipes, I guess. I sat up, the sheet sliding off my legs. My skin was cold, like the air had dropped overnight. The radiator in our room was off. I'd meant to check it the night before and forgot. The apartment was quiet in the way a place is quiet when it's empty of your normal sounds. We hadn't unpacked enough to make it ours yet. Even our toothbrushes were still in a box. Leah came back into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. "I'm fine," she said, before I'd even asked. I watched her face. She looked tired, but that was expected. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and there was a faint crease on her cheek from the pillow. Everything about her was familiar. That's why I didn't push. I got up, put on a sweater, and went to find the box with the kettle so we could make coffee. The kitchen window looked out onto the building across the narrow street. I could see someone's balcony plants drooping in the rain. The sink water ran cloudy for a second before clearing. I told myself that was normal for old pipes. The kettle made a low whine as it heated, and the sound filled the room in a comforting way. Ordinary sounds, ordinary mornings. That's what I wanted. The story of two people starting over in a new place, adjusting, settling in. Leah leaned against the counter with her arms crossed and watched the water boil. Her gaze wasn't on the kettle. It was on the corner of the ceiling above the cabinets, where the paint had bubbled slightly from old moisture. Her eyes tracked along the line where the wall met the ceiling as if she were measuring it. "Do you smell that?" she asked. I lifted the kettle lid and let steam hit my face. "Smell what?" she frowned. "Like pennies. Like blood," I inhaled. There was a metallic tang in the air, but it was faint. The kind of smell you notice if someone mentions it, and then can't unnotice. "It's probably the radiators," I said. "Old metal. We haven't run them yet." She didn't argue. She nodded once and reached for a mug. That was the first time the idea formed, small and easy to dismiss, that Leah was paying attention to the apartment in a way I wasn't. Not fear, exactly, more like alertness, as if she were waiting for something to prove itself. I told myself it was normal. Leah had always been more sensitive to environments. New sounds bothered her. Smells lingered in her mind longer than mine. She noticed drafts. She noticed when a room felt off. It was one of the things I loved about her, the way she moved through the world as if it was real enough to touch. Over the next few days, we did what people do. We unpacked. We built shelves with missing screws. We argued quietly about where the couch should go. We took turns running down to the street to carry up another box. Our fingers became dry from cardboard. The apartment slowly filled with our life, our books, our mismatched plates, the cheap lamp Leah insisted on buying because she liked the shape of the shade. When I came home from meeting a client, Leah would be sitting on the floor surrounded by open boxes, her knees pulled to her chest, deciding where things belonged. At night, the city outside settled into a rhythm. The streetlight buzzed faintly. A bus would pass and make the windows tremble almost imperceptibly. Somewhere in the building, someone would shower late, and the pipes would clank in the walls like knuckles on a door. I stopped noticing. Leah didn't. Sometimes, when I turned off the bedroom light, I'd see her face angled toward the ceiling, her eyes open in the dark. "What?" I'd whisper. "Nothing," she'd say, and then she'd turn toward me, and her breath would even out as if she'd been holding it. On the 5th night, we finally hung curtains. It should have made the room feel safer, more enclosed. Instead, the fabric made the air feel heavier. The streetlight glow no longer painted the floor. The darkness was complete, like the room had been sealed. Leah went to sleep with her back to me. I lay there and listened, not because I was afraid, but because the quiet demanded attention. The building made its usual noises. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere, a radio turned on and then off. Ordinary. And yet, in the space between those sounds, I became aware of something else. The absence of our own noises. No television in the next room, no neighbors' laughter, no footsteps above us because we were the top floor. Just us in the apartment. I remember thinking, before I finally drifted off, that the place still didn't feel like ours. It felt like we were borrowing it from someone who might come back at any moment and expect to find everything exactly as it had been. The rear background Leah and I had been together a little over 3 years when we moved. Long enough that we had routines that felt permanent. Short enough that we still surprised each other sometimes. We met through mutual friends at a birthday dinner. She laughed once, quietly, at something I said under my breath, and then she asked me a question that made it clear she'd actually been listening. After that, it was small things. Coffee after her shift, late walks, her toothbrush left at my place, my spare key on her ring. I had a spare key by then, and my coffee mug lived in her sink. She was practical in the way that makes you feel safe. She worked long shifts at the pharmacy, came home exhausted, still remembered to pay the bills on time. She kept a notebook in her bag with lists and numbers and reminders. If she said she'd do something, she did it. That steadiness was one of the reasons I stopped sleeping with one ear open when she was around. At the same time, she had an odd sensitivity I never fully understood. Not mystical, physical. Certain fluorescent lights made her nauseous. Strong perfume gave her migraines. She could walk into a room and pause, as if her body was taking inventory of the air, the temperature, the sound. When she said a place felt tight, she meant it literally. Her ribs, her throat, the back of her tongue. I'd seen her leave concerts early because the bass made her teeth ache. I'd watched her open windows in winter because she said the air had turned stale and she couldn't think. Because of that, I didn't dismiss her small reactions in the new apartment. I filed them away as information, the way you file away a check engine light that goes off and then disappears. Worth noting. Not proof of anything. The weeks before the move had worn her down. The pharmacy was short-staffed. She was covering extra evenings, leaving our old apartment in the dark and coming back to it in the dark. When she was home, she moved like someone trying to conserve energy. Quiet feet, careful hands. I'd catch her staring at her phone with her thumb hovering over messages she didn't send. If I asked what was wrong, she'd say she was fine, and then she'd forget to eat until midnight. Money didn't help. We were stable but not comfortable. My contract work came in waves. Her salary was steady but not high. Every unexpected expense tightened something behind my sternum. Leah didn't panic about money, but she hated uncertainty. She liked to know exactly what was coming. The new apartment, with its lower rent and closer commute, felt like a chance to breathe. I think we both wanted to believe we'd found a break. The building itself didn't announce anything unusual. 6 stories, a lobby with mailboxes and scuffed tile, an elevator that worked but sounded tired. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and a lemony cleaning product that never quite masked old dust. Most neighbors kept to themselves. In the first week, we met a woman on the 3rd floor who smelled strongly of fabric softener and stared at Leah's hands as if she were checking for rings. We met an older man with a shopping cart full of empty bottles who nodded at us once and didn't speak. We heard a baby cry behind a door we never saw open. That was it. One afternoon, as we were bringing up a box of books, the elevator stalled between floors for a few seconds. The light stayed on, but the air changed, stale, warmer, like the inside of a closet. Leah's fingers tightened on the cardboard handle. I could hear her breathing. Then the elevator lurched and continued upward. When we stepped out on our floor, she laughed once too sharply and said, "It's fine," before I spoke. Our door was at the end of the hallway, slightly separated from the others by a short stretch of blank wall. It should have felt private. Instead, it made me feel like we were on an island, cut off from the small, normal noise of other lives. The apartment had little signs of its previous tenant, the kind that always get left behind no matter how much you clean. A nick in the doorframe at shoulder height, a faint ring on the living room parquet where a plant pot had sat, 2 small holes above the dining area where something heavy had been mounted and removed. Leah noticed these things and touched them with her fingertips, not absent-mindedly, but with the attention you give a bruise. On the 2nd day, she found a thin rectangle of paper tucked behind the top drawer in the kitchen, like it had been slid in and forgotten. It wasn't a letter, just a torn-off corner of an envelope with a partial name printed in faded ink. I couldn't make out the address. The paper smelled old, sweet, and dusty. Leah held it up to the light, squinting, then dropped it in the trash. Afterward, she washed her hands longer than usual, scrubbing between her fingers like she'd touched something greasy. I tried to make our new place feel alive. I played music while we unpacked. I cooked the first real meal we'd eaten at a table in days. Pasta, too much garlic, cheap wine from the corner store. We sat on folding chairs because the dining set hadn't arrived yet, and I watched Leah's shoulders loosen a little with each bite. For a moment, it felt like we'd made the right decision. The apartment was just an apartment. The quiet was just quiet. Then there were the small moments that didn't fit. One evening, I came home and found all the cabinet doors in the kitchen open, just slightly, not flung wide. Open, as if someone had gone through them and then decided not to close them. Leah was in the living room with her laptop, feet tucked under her, watching a training video. I asked if she'd been looking for something. She frowned, got up, and closed the doors one by one with careful hands. "I didn't," she said, and I believed she believed it. The next morning, I woke to the bathroom tap running, steady and cold. Leah stood at the sink with her hands under the water. She wasn't washing them. She was just holding them there, staring at her fingers as if she were waiting for them to change color. When I spoke, she startled so hard water splashed onto the mirror. She shut the tap quickly and said, "I was cold," and then, after a beat, asked, "Did you sleep?" The question wasn't really about sleep. It was about whether I'd heard anything she had. Leah had never sleepwalked. She'd never talked in her sleep. If she got up at night, it was for the bathroom, and she'd come back and sink into the mattress with a familiar sigh. In the new apartment, I started to realize I was listening for that sigh, for proof that she was still moving through the night in the way I knew. A week in, our internet still wasn't working properly. Leah's phone kept losing service in the bedroom like the walls swallowed it. Without screens, without the easy distraction, the apartment felt louder in its quiet. We went to bed earlier. We talked more, but the conversations circled safe subjects. The deeper things stayed untouched, like we were both waiting for the other to bring them up first. One night, lying in the dark, Leah slid her hand toward mine. Her palm was damp. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" she whispered. I wanted to say no, to reassure her, to make it simple. Instead, I said, "Sometimes. But I think that's just a new place. New sounds." In the dark, I couldn't see her face, only the shape of her head against the pillow. "It's not sounds," she said, and then she turned onto her side with her back to me again. The next day, she apologized over coffee. "I'm just tired," she said. "Don't listen to me." I told her it was normal. I told her what people say when they want to smooth something over. She nodded, grateful, but her expression stayed thin, like she'd accepted comfort without believing it. That evening, I came home to find her sitting on the living room floor with a tape measure stretched across the hallway. She measured from the bedroom door to the bathroom, then from the bathroom to the kitchen. She wrote the numbers in her notebook in small, precise handwriting. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Planning," and then, after a blink, added, "Where to put the shelf?" But the numbers weren't shelf numbers. They were distances between doors, between rooms, between exits. I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, drying a glass, feeling my throat tighten with a quiet dread that had nothing to do with ghost stories. It was the dread of watching someone you love behave like they're preparing for something they can't name. The first irregularities. The first clear change in Leah wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment I could point to and say, "That's when it started." It was more like watching someone drift a few degrees off course and only realizing how far they'd gone when you could no longer see the shore. It began with her sleep. She started going to bed earlier than usual, sometimes right after dinner, saying her head felt heavy. When I joined her later, she would already be on her side, facing the wall, her body curled in on itself. At first I thought she was just exhausted. Then I noticed how still she was. Not the loose stillness of deep sleep, but a held stillness, like a person pretending. One night I brushed my hand against her arm as I lay down. Her skin was cold. Not just cool from the air, but cold in a way that made my fingers pause. I whispered her name. She didn't answer. Her breathing was slow, shallow, perfectly even. When I pressed my palm more firmly to her forearm, she shifted slightly, just enough to break the contact, and pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders. In the morning, she acted normal. Too normal. She made coffee, asked about my work, complained about a customer who'd tried to return medication without a receipt. If I mentioned the night, she'd frown like she didn't remember it. "I slept straight through," she'd say. "That's good, right?" I wanted to believe her. Then there were the sounds. Not loud sounds. Nothing you could record and play back and point to as evidence. Just soft, misplaced ones. A faint scuff from the hallway when we were both in the living room. A dull knock that might have been pipes, except it came from inside the walls, not within them. The sound of fabric shifting, like someone adjusting sheets, when Leah was standing next to me brushing her teeth. I started doing small checks without telling her. Looking into rooms before turning off lights, making sure the balcony door was locked even though we hadn't opened it. Once, coming home early, I stood outside our apartment door and listened before unlocking it. I don't know what I expected to hear. Voices, maybe. Movement. Instead, there was nothing. The kind of nothing that presses against your ears. Leah stopped singing. She used to hum when she cooked, barely audible, more vibration than sound. In the new apartment, the kitchen was silent except for the scrape of utensils and the click of the stove. When I pointed it out lightly, trying not to sound worried, she looked at me like she didn't understand the question. "I didn't realize," she said, and went back to chopping vegetables with careful, even strokes. The notebook changed too. She'd always kept lists, but now the lists weren't practical. They weren't groceries or chores. They were observations. Times. Short phrases written without context. 2:14 a.m. Hallway cold. 3:02 a.m. Smell again. Door feels heavier tonight. I found the notebook open on the coffee table one afternoon. Leah was in the shower. I stood there longer than I should have, reading the same lines over and over. When the water shut off, I closed it quickly and put it back exactly where it had been, my pulse loud in my ears. I told myself it was stress, that she was externalizing anxiety the way she always did, by writing it down. That night, I dreamed I was awake. In the dream, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of Leah's body next to me. She was facing me now, her eyes open. In the dream, I tried to move, to speak, and couldn't. Leah's mouth moved soundlessly. Then she slid out of bed without a sound and stood over me, looking down, her face empty of expression. I woke with my heart hammering, breath trapped in my chest. The room was dark. The curtains barely stirred. Leah was gone. I sat up so fast the mattress creaked. The space beside me was cold, not recently vacated. Cold like it hadn't held a body in a while. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every nerve alert, listening. The bathroom light was on. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the floor. The bathroom door was open. Leah stood inside, facing the mirror. The tap was off. The light was harsh, flattening her features. She wasn't moving. She wasn't looking at her reflection either. Her eyes were fixed on the spot just above it, where the mirror met the wall. "Leah," I said. She didn't react. I said her name again, louder. Still nothing. My mouth went dry. I stepped into the bathroom. The air felt colder there, like the room held on to chill longer than it should. I reached out and touched her shoulder. She turned instantly. Too instantly. No transition, no delay. 1 second she was still, the next she was facing me, her eyes wide, pupils blown so large the brown was barely visible. Her expression wasn't fear. It was irritation, like I'd interrupted something important. "What?" she snapped. I pulled my hand back. Are you okay?" She blinked. Once. Twice. Her face softened, confusion replacing the sharpness. "You scared me," she said and laughed weakly. I couldn't sleep. "Were you dreaming?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I was awake." She looked at the mirror, then back at me. "I thought I heard someone in the hallway." "There's no one," I said, though I hadn't checked. She nodded, as if that settled it, and brushed past me back toward the bedroom. As she climbed into bed, she turned her back to me again. I lay awake until dawn, watching the pale light creep under the curtains, replaying the way she'd looked at me in the bathroom. Not like she was scared, like she was annoyed I'd caught her doing something private. After that, the nights blurred together. Leah started waking up with bruises she couldn't explain, faint ones, yellowing at the edges, on her thighs, on the inside of her arms. She joked about bumping into furniture. I laughed along, then started memorizing the layout of the apartment, the angles of corners, the heights of door handles. None of it matched. She began rearranging things while I was at work. Not in big ways. Subtle shifts. Chairs angled slightly differently. A lamp moved a few inches to the left. Once, the bed was rotated, so the headboard rested against the opposite wall. When I asked why, she said, it felt better that way. She couldn't explain what that meant. The smell came back more often. Metallic, faintly sweet. It would appear suddenly in one room and vanish just as quickly. Leah noticed it before I did. She'd stop mid-sentence, inhale, and go still. Her eyes would track toward a doorway, as if following something invisible. I started feeling watched, too. Not constantly, just in brief, sharp moments. Standing in the shower with my eyes closed, certain someone was in the room. Sitting on the couch, feeling the urge to look over my shoulder. Each time I did, there was nothing. The apartment remained stubbornly ordinary. Our furniture, our clutter, our lives. That ordinariness made the feeling worse. There was nowhere to put the fear. No shape to give it. One afternoon, I came home early again. Leah was supposed to be at work. The apartment was dark, curtains drawn. I called her name. No answer. My chest tightened. I moved through the rooms quickly, checking each one. Bedroom empty. Bathroom empty. Kitchen empty. Then I heard breathing. It came from the second bedroom, the one we used for storage. I opened the door slowly. Leah sat on the floor in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around them. Her head was bowed. She was rocking slightly, back and forth, back and forth. Her breathing was fast, shallow, like she'd been running. "Leah," I said softly. She looked up. Her face was streaked with tears she hadn't wiped away. "It doesn't like it when you're gone," she said. My stomach dropped. What doesn't? She seemed to realize what she'd said. Her eyes widened. She shook her head hard. "Nothing. I mean, this place. I hate being alone here." I knelt in front of her and took her hands. They were ice cold. Then don't be, I said. We can figure something out. You can come to my office, or I'll work from home more. She nodded, but she didn't look relieved. She looked like someone agreeing because it was easier than explaining why it wouldn't help. That night, as we lay in bed, Leah whispered, "If I start acting strange, promise you won't leave." The question hit me harder than any noise or smell had. "You're not strange," I said automatically. She turned to face me. In the dark, I could just make out the outline of her eyes. "Promise," she said again. "I promise," I said. I didn't know then how much that promise would cost. Escalating tension. After that promise, I started measuring time by Leah's moods instead of clocks. Good mornings were quiet and efficient. She'd wake before me, shower, leave the bed neatly made. I'd find her at the table with her notebook closed, drinking coffee and staring out the kitchen window. On those mornings, she kissed me goodbye like she always had, a brief press of lips, familiar and grounding. I'd go to work thinking maybe we'd turned a corner. Bad mornings announced themselves in my body before my mind caught up. The air would feel wrong when I opened my eyes, too thick, too cold. Leah would already be gone from the bed, but the indentation on her side would still be there, as if she'd just stood up. I'd find her somewhere in the apartment, motionless, listening. On those days, she didn't want to be touched. She stopped going into the second bedroom entirely. The door stayed closed. When I asked why, she said, "There's nothing in there we need." When I suggested moving some boxes out, she shook her head too quickly. "Leave it," she said. "Please." I started sleeping lightly. Every sound pulled me up to the surface. The building's normal noises began to separate themselves into patterns. The radiators tick at exactly the same time every night. The elevator's distant whine. The neighbor's footsteps above us stopping at midnight. In between those predictable sounds, there were others that didn't repeat. A single footstep in the hallway when no one was there. A faint thud against the wall by the bed, like a hand placed and removed. Leah began standing in doorways. I'd look up from my laptop and find her framed by the bedroom door, watching me. She didn't smile when our eyes met. She didn't look away either. She'd just stand there until I spoke, and then she'd blink, as if coming back from far away. Her reflection started lagging. That's the only way I can describe it without exaggeration. I noticed it in the bathroom mirror first. Leah was brushing her teeth, moving her hand in steady strokes. For a split second, her reflection didn't match her movement. It was subtle, like a dropped frame in a video. Then it corrected itself. I said nothing. I told myself it was the light, my eyes, fatigue. It happened again in the kitchen window at night. I saw her reflection standing behind me, her head tilted at an angle she wasn't actually holding. When I turned, she was normal again, looking confused at my sudden movement. She stopped taking her notebook to work. It stayed on the nightstand now, closed. I asked if she was still writing. She said no. "I don't need to anymore." The smells grew stronger. Metallic at first, then layered with something organic, something that reminded me of damp soil and old leaves. It lingered longest in the hallway and near the second bedroom door. I bought cleaning products, scrubbed surfaces until my hands cracked. The smell always came back. Leah said nothing about it anymore. She'd just wrinkle her nose slightly and move to another room. One night I woke to the mattress shifting. Leah was sitting upright beside me, her back straight, her hands resting flat on her thighs. Her head was tilted slightly to the left, her eyes open. She wasn't looking at anything I could see. The room was dark, but the streetlight leaked through the curtains enough to outline her face. Her mouth was open just a little, like she was about to speak. I whispered her name. She didn't react. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached out slowly, my fingers shaking, and touched her wrist. Her skin was cold again, colder than the air. The moment I made contact, she inhaled sharply and turned to me. This time there was no irritation, no confusion, just a flat, distant awareness, like she was looking through me instead of at me. "It's standing too close," she said. I pulled my hand back as if burned. "What is?" She frowned, her face tightening like she was in pain. Then she shook her head hard and lay back down. Within seconds, her breathing deepened into sleep. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I called in sick to work. I stayed home, moving through the apartment quietly, listening. Nothing happened. The normality was oppressive. It felt like the place was holding its breath. In the afternoon, I heard the front door open and close. Leia had come home early. I went to meet her, relief flooding my chest. She stood in the hallway, her bag on the floor, staring at the second bedroom door. "It opened," she said. I followed her gaze. The door was ajar by a few inches. I was sure I'd closed it that morning. I walked forward and pushed it shut. The latch clicked softly. "It does that sometimes," I said, hating how weak my voice sounded. Leah watched me like she didn't believe me. That night, she insisted we move the bed back to its original position. She said she needed to be able to see the hallway from where she slept. When I asked why, she said, "So it doesn't surprise me." She began waking up with marks that were no longer bruises. Red lines, shallow but angry, crossing her ribs, her shoulders. They looked like scratches, but not from fingernails. The skin around them was raised, irritated. She wore long sleeves even when it was warm. When I suggested seeing a doctor, she refused. "They'll just tell me I'm stressed," she said. And I'm not. I'm adapting. Adapting to what, I wanted to ask? I didn't. One evening, as we sat on the couch in silence, she turned to me and asked, "Do you hear it breathing?" I held my own breath, listening. There was nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant city noise. "No," I said. She nodded slowly. "That's good." The feeling of being watched became constant. It pressed against my spine, made my shoulders hunch. I stopped inviting friends over. I stopped answering calls. The apartment felt like a sealed system now. Everything contained. No outside air allowed in. Late one night, I woke to the sound of the second bedroom door opening. I lay frozen, counting my breaths, listening to the soft scrape of wood on wood. Leah was still beside me, her breathing slow. I told myself it was the building settling. I told myself it was nothing. Then I felt the mattress dip on my side of the bed. Not like someone sitting, like someone leaning in, putting weight down carefully. The air above my face felt colder, heavier. I squeezed my eyes shut and stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement would acknowledge whatever was there. After a long moment, the pressure lifted. The sound retreated down the hallway. The door closed. In the morning, Leah looked at me with something like pity. "You noticed it," she said quietly. That was when I realized she'd stopped asking me if I heard things. She already knew. Critical incident. I stopped trusting my own senses somewhere in the middle of the second week, when the apartment began to feel less like a place and more like a condition. I'd leave for an hour to buy groceries and come back to the same rooms, the same furniture, the same air, but my body would react as if I'd stepped into a stranger's home. My stomach would tighten. My skin would prickle. Leah would be there, moving with that careful, economical precision, and I'd realize I was watching her the way you watch a door you're afraid might open on its own. The only thing that made any of it feel real was how consistent the nights became. Around 2 in the morning, the hallway would turn colder. Not gradually, the way temperature shifts normally happen, but abruptly, like a boundary had been drawn down the center of the apartment. If I got up and stood in the doorway, I could feel it on my shins, a low draft that didn't come from the windows or the balcony. The bathroom tiles would sweat slightly despite the radiator being off. The air would smell metallic, then earthy, then briefly clean, as if someone had opened a window and closed it again and wanted me to notice the difference. Leah would wake before the first sound. Sometimes it was just her breathing changing. Sometimes she'd sit up in bed in that same stiff posture, hands flat on her thighs, head angled like she was listening with more than her ears. The first time after the mattress dip, I forced myself to speak. "Leah," I whispered, keeping my voice level. "If you're awake, talk to me." Her eyes moved toward me, but it didn't look like she was focusing. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't make it notice you." The words landed in my chest with a dull weight. I waited, expecting her to realize what she'd said, to backtrack, to laugh it off. She didn't. She lay back down slowly, as if lowering herself into water, and within a minute her breathing was deep again. The next morning she made coffee and asked if we needed more dishwasher tablets. Her voice was normal. Her face was normal. I began to understand something that I hated. Whatever was happening at night, Leah either couldn't remember it or couldn't admit to remembering it. The daylight version of her was defending itself from the night version, and I was stuck between them. I started documenting. At first, it was just notes in my phone. Times, smells, sounds, what Leah did. Then I bought a cheap digital thermometer and put it in the hallway. I checked it like a man checking a wound. The numbers were unremarkable during the day. At night, they dipped by a few degrees for no clear reason, and then rose again before dawn. I bought a carbon monoxide detector and set it in the bedroom. It stayed silent. I checked the stove connections. I called the utility company to ask if there had been any reported issues in the building. They said no. Leah noticed the detector and the thermometer and didn't ask. That absence of curiosity made me more uneasy than if she'd accused me of paranoia. It was as if she already knew there was no point. On the 18th night, maybe the 19th, the days blurred. I decided I needed proof of my own reality. Not proof for police or for a doctor. Proof for me, so I could stop asking myself if I was manufacturing it. I set up my old phone as a camera. It wasn't sophisticated. I propped it on a stack of books on the dresser, angled toward the bedroom door and the stretch of hallway beyond. I plugged it into a charger so it wouldn't die. I turned on an app that recorded video when it detected movement. The little red icon made my skin crawl, like I was betraying something private, but I told myself I was protecting her. Protecting us. Leah watched me while I adjusted the angle. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice mild. "Just trying to see if the hallway light flickers at night," I said. It was the first lie I'd told her that felt heavy in my mouth. She nodded once. "Okay." That night we went to bed early. Leah insisted the second bedroom door stay closed. She asked me to lock the front door twice. I did. I checked the chain. I checked the deadbolt. I checked the balcony. When we lay down, she rolled onto her side facing me, which she hadn't done in days. Her eyes were open. "If I get up," she said, "don't touch me." The hairs on my arms lifted. "Why?" Her throat moved as she swallowed. "Because you'll make it angry." My tongue felt thick. "Leah, what is it?" She stared at me in the dim light leaking through the curtains. Her expression was exhausted, old around the eyes. "It's the apartment," she said, and there was a tremor in her voice, like she was close to crying. "It's the space where we are. It was here before us." Then she turned away, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and went still. I lay awake, listening to her breathing, to the building's familiar noises, to my own heart. Around 2, the hallway temperature dropped. I felt it even from the bed. The air against my face changed, cooler, as if someone had opened a fridge door nearby. Leah's breathing shifted. She sat up. I kept my eyes half closed, pretending sleep, because some instinct told me that watching directly would change the outcome. The mattress dipped. The sheet slid. Leah's bare feet touched the floor with no sound. She stood there for a moment. I could hear her swallowing, a small wet click. Then she walked toward the door. Not the bathroom, not the kitchen. The hallway. I opened my eyes fully and watched her silhouette move through the doorway. The bedroom was dark enough that I could barely see her, but I could see the outline of her shoulders, the way her head was slightly bowed. I whispered her name once, very softly. She didn't respond. A few seconds later, the hallway light came on. It wasn't on a timer. We controlled it by switch. It clicked on as if someone had flipped it. The light spilled into the bedroom in a long strip. Leah was standing in the hallway facing the second bedroom door. She lifted her hand and placed her palm flat against the door, right over the spot where the wood was darker from age. She held it there, motionless. Then she began to slide her palm downward, slow, steady, like she was smoothing an invisible wrinkle. The smell hit me hard, metal, damp earth, something faintly sweet. My stomach lurched. Leah's head turned slightly as if she heard something. Her shoulders rose a fraction. She leaned closer to the door, her ear nearly touching the wood. For a moment she looked like herself, like a woman trying to listen to a neighbor. Then her mouth moved. No sound reached me, but I saw her lips form words. Short phrases repeated. Her jaw tightened. Her hand continued moving, now tracing along the edge of the door frame. I forced myself out of bed and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, keeping distance like she'd asked. My feet were cold on the floor. My knees felt loose. "Leah," I said louder now, trying to keep my voice calm. "Come back to bed." Her head snapped toward me. In the hallway light, I saw her face clearly. Her eyes were open but wrong, too wide, too fixed. Her pupils were huge. Her lips were dry, slightly cracked. She looked through me like I was a shape in her way. She raised one finger to her mouth. Not a gentle shushing gesture. A warning. Then she turned back to the door and did something that made my throat close. She hooked her fingers under the edge of the door and pulled. The door opened without resistance. I'd expected it to stick. It always stuck. But it swung inward smoothly, silently, as if it had been oiled. The second bedroom was dark. We'd never installed a lamp in there. The only light came from the hallway and fell across stacked boxes and the outline of a folded mattress leaning against the wall. Leah stepped inside. I stayed in the hallway, my hand hovering near the wall as if I needed something to hold. The air at the threshold felt colder, like the room was a pocket of refrigerated space. The smell was strongest there. Leah moved past the boxes as if she knew exactly where to go. She knelt in the far corner beside the wall where we'd stacked suitcases. Her hands disappeared behind them. I heard the faint scrape of plastic against wood. I leaned forward, trying to see. "Leah, stop," I said, and my voice finally cracked. "Please." She didn't stop. She shifted the suitcases with a strength that didn't look like hers. She pulled them aside, revealing the baseboard. Then she pressed her fingers into the thin line where the baseboard met the floor and tugged. The baseboard popped loose with a soft snap. My stomach turned over. I hadn't noticed anything loose there before. Leah lifted the strip of wood away carefully and set it on the floor. Behind it was a narrow gap. Too narrow to be a door, too deep to be just a crack. A dark space inside the wall. Leah leaned in. I heard her inhale, slow and deep, like someone taking in a scent. The skin on my arms tightened with goosebumps. Then she reached into the gap. Her fingers moved as if feeling for something familiar. Her shoulders tensed. She pulled back and brought something into the light. At first I thought it was cloth. Then I saw it was hair. Not a brush. Not a wig. A loose bundle of cut hair tied with a thin string. Dark, matted, mixed with something pale that might have been dust or dried skin. The sight made bile rise in my throat. Leah held it up near her face. Her expression softened in a way that made my skin crawl. Not affection, not comfort, something more vacant like recognition. She pressed the bundle to her cheek. I made a sound I didn't recognize as mine, a choked breath. Leah turned her head slowly toward me, hair still against her skin. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was assessing my reaction. Her mouth opened. "It's mine," she said. The words were clear. Her voice was low, flat, not quite her tone. I felt the room tilt. "That's not—" I started, but my mouth wouldn't form the rest. Leah's lips twitched almost like a smile. It was always mine. My hands were shaking. "Put that down," I said. Leah listened to me. "Put it down and come out." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she lowered the hair bundle and tucked it back into the wall with delicate care, like returning something precious. She pressed the baseboard back into place. It clicked, as if it had always been designed to open. Then she stood up. As she rose, her head tilted again, and I realized she was listening, not to me, but to something behind the wall. Her shoulders lifted with a shallow inhale. Her eyes drifted to the ceiling corner, as if tracking a movement above us. I heard it then, too. A faint sound, not a voice, not a step. A soft, rhythmic exhale, like someone breathing through their nose in the dark. It came from inside the wall. Every muscle in my body locked. My mind tried to reject it, to label it as pipes, as the building settling. But it was too regular, too intimate. Breathing has a shape. You know when it's human because your body knows what it means to share air. Leah's face changed. The vacant recognition disappeared, replaced by something like tension, like a dog hearing another dog too close. She stepped toward the gap again, pressed her palm against the wall and whispered, "Not now." The breathing stopped. Silence flooded the room so completely my ears rang. Leah turned back toward me, and for the first time in days I saw fear on her face. Real, human fear, like she'd surfaced for a moment and saw what was happening. "Lock the door," she whispered. "Please." I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was stuck on the sound that had come from the wall. My throat felt swollen. Leah's eyes widened. "Lock it," she said again, sharper, and her voice broke. That snapped me loose. I stepped backward into the hallway, reached for the second bedroom door, and pulled it shut. My hands fumbled. The latch clicked. There was no lock on that door, just a handle. I held it anyway, gripping it hard as if my strength could substitute for a bolt. Leah stood inside the room, facing me through the closed door, as if she could see through it. Then the hallway light flickered. Once, twice. It steadied. The air thickened. The metallic smell surged, then vanished as if sucked away. My mouth filled with saliva like I was about to vomit. I heard a new sound, a soft scrape close to the floor from the other side of the door. Like fingernails on wood. Slow. Testing. My hands tightened on the handle until my knuckles hurt. "Leah," I said, my voice shaking. "Come out." Now. There was no answer. The scrape continued, then paused. Then came again higher, closer to where my hands were. Not frantic. Patient. Then, very softly, a knock from inside the wall beside the door. One knock. Pause. Another. Pause. Like someone tapping from the inside to locate the edge. I backed away, leaving the door closed, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway felt too narrow. The apartment felt suddenly small, packed tight with air and walls and whatever was behind them. I ran to the bedroom and grabbed my phone. The camera app was still recording. The screen showed the empty hallway, the strip of light. Then Leah's silhouette, moving. Then her hand on the door. Then nothing. The app had stopped recording minutes ago, as if it had detected no movement after she entered the second bedroom, even though I knew she'd been there. I shoved the phone in my pocket and went back into the hallway. The second bedroom door was open. Just a few inches. I hadn't opened it. The hallway light was off now. Only the dim bedroom light behind me offered any illumination. I stepped closer. Every part of me braced for some confirmation that I was wrong. "Leah?" I called. No answer. I pushed the door open slowly. The second bedroom was empty. Boxes stacked neatly. Suitcases in their place. The baseboard intact. No sign it had ever been moved. No smell. Just dust and cardboard. My mouth went dry. I moved deeper into the room, checking corners like an idiot. There was nowhere for her to be. No closet. No window open. The balcony was on the other side of the apartment. I turned back into the hallway and called again, louder. My voice sounded strange, too loud in the sleeping building. The bathroom light was on. I ran to it. Leah stood at the sink, hands under running water, staring at her fingers as if nothing had happened. Her hair was dry. Her face was calm. I stopped in the doorway, chest heaving. "Where were you?" I demanded. She looked up slowly. Her eyes focused on me like she'd just noticed I existed. "What do you mean?" "You were in the second bedroom," I said. Leah, you opened the wall." Her eyebrows drew together. "I haven't been in there," she said, and her voice was almost annoyed. "I told you not to touch me at night, and you did anyway, didn't you?" "I didn't touch you," I said. My voice cracked. "I didn't. I watched you." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she shut off the tap. The silence after the water stopped was thick. She dried her hands carefully, each finger as if following a routine. "You shouldn't watch," she said quietly. "It doesn't like being watched." The words chilled me more than the hallway air ever had. "Who told you that?" Leah's eyes flicked toward the mirror just above her reflection. "No one," she said. "I just know." I backed away from the bathroom, my legs weak. I went to the front door and checked the locks. Deadbolt engaged. Chain in place. I checked the balcony door. Locked. Windows closed. There was no way she could have moved from that room to the bathroom without passing me. Unless I hadn't actually seen what I thought I saw. Unless the apartment was making a fool out of my senses. Or unless there was a way through the walls I didn't understand. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, listening. Leah went back to bed as if nothing had happened. Around 4, the smell returned briefly near the second bedroom door, then faded. I heard a soft knock inside the wall again, this time deeper, as if coming from farther away. In the morning, I confronted Marino. I didn't tell him about breathing in the walls or hair bundles. I told him the second bedroom door was sticking strangely, that the baseboard seemed loose, that we thought there might be pests or water damage. I asked if there were any service shafts behind that wall, any old ventilation, any access panels. There was a pause on the phone, the kind that makes you feel the other person deciding what to say. "No," Marino said finally. "It's a standard wall. Old building, yes, but no tunnels. Why would there be?" "I heard sounds," I said, forcing myself to sound casual. "Like someone inside the wall." He laughed once, too quickly. "Inside the wall," he repeated, like the phrase amused him. "You're new there. You'll hear all kinds of things. Pipes, neighbors. Don't worry," I pressed him. "Who lived there before us?" "The older woman." "What was her name?" Another pause. "I told you," he said, and his voice hardened slightly. "She moved. It doesn't matter. I can't give out private information." "It matters to me," I said. "It shouldn't," he replied, and then, as if catching himself, softened his tone. "Look, I can send someone to check the door. A handyman. He can come tomorrow." "Tomorrow," I repeated. "Yes," he said. "Be home." After I hung up, my hands were sweating. Leah sat at the table drinking coffee, watching me. Her expression was unreadable. "You called him," she said. "Yeah," I said. "I want someone to look at the wall." Leah's fingers tightened around her mug. "Don't," she said, and it wasn't a request. "We can't live like this," I replied. Her eyes flicked to the second bedroom door, then back to me. "It will punish you," she said softly. It punished her. I felt a cold line run down my spine. Who is her? Leah blinked as if waking. Her mouth opened and closed. "I don't know," she whispered, and her lower lip trembled. I don't know why I said that. That afternoon, I skipped work and started inspecting the apartment like a man trying to prove he's sane. I ran my fingers along the baseboards, pressing for loose spots. I knocked on the walls, listening for hollow spaces. Most of it sounded solid. The wall by the second bedroom corner sounded slightly different, deeper, as if there was a gap behind it. It could have been studs. It could have been nothing. I found myself pressing my ear against it, holding my breath, waiting for that intimate exhale. Nothing. When evening came, the building settled into its usual quiet. Leah moved through dinner like she was underwater. She ate little. Her eyes kept drifting to corners of rooms, to doorways. Twice she paused mid-chew and swallowed hard, as if something in her throat had tightened. I tried to make conversation. She answered with single words. At around 10, she got up from the table and went into the hallway. I heard the second bedroom door handle turn. I stood so fast my chair scraped. "Leah," I called. She didn't answer. I followed her into the hallway and found her standing in front of the second bedroom door, her hand on the handle, her head tilted. The hallway light was off. Her face was half-shadowed. "Don't go in there," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. She turned to look at me. Her eyes were clear now, and the fear in them was unmistakable. "I don't want to," she whispered. "But it's making me." The phrase lodged in my chest. My mouth went dry. "Then come with me," I said. "We'll leave. We'll go to a hotel. We'll stay with friends. Anywhere." Leah shook her head, small, helpless. "It won't let me," she whispered. I stepped closer. "Leah, listen. We can walk out that door right now." Her hand tightened on the handle until the tendons showed. "If I leave," she said, "it follows." A sudden anger flared in me. Anger at the apartment, at Marino, at the invisible pressure turning my girlfriend into a stranger. "That's not real," I snapped, and immediately regretted it. Leah's face changed. The fear drained out, replaced by that flat distance. Her shoulders dropped. She turned back to the door and pushed it open. The smell rolled out like a wave, metal and wet soil and something sour. My stomach clenched. Leah stepped inside and vanished into darkness. I forced myself after her. The room was colder than the hallway. The boxes loomed like shapes. My eyes adjusted slowly. Leah stood in the far corner by the suitcases, exactly where she'd been the previous night. Her movements were purposeful now, practiced. She knelt, fingers sliding under the baseboard. "No," I whispered and moved closer. She looked over her shoulder at me, and the expression she gave me was not Leah's. It was annoyance, weary and contemptuous, like I was a child interrupting an adult's work. She pulled the baseboard loose. Behind it, the gap was there again, black, narrow, deeper than any wall should be. She reached in. I grabbed her wrist. The moment my fingers closed around her skin, pain shot up my arm as if I'd pressed my hand against ice too long. Not burning, not sharp, a deep, numbing ache that made my fingers want to release. Leah didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly toward me. "Don't," she said, and her voice was low, unfamiliar. I tightened my grip anyway, because if I let go, I didn't know what would happen. "Leah," I said through clenched teeth. "Look at me." Her eyes met mine. For a second, something flickered, confusion, like she was trying to surface. Then her gaze slid past my shoulder toward the doorway, toward the hallway beyond, and her mouth softened into that vacant recognition again. The air behind me changed. I felt it, the way you feel someone step into a room before you see them. The hairs on my neck rose. The cold in the room thickened. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Leah whispered, "It's here." A sound came from the wall. Not breathing this time. Something else. A soft dragging like cloth against plaster, moving upward. Slow. Deliberate. As if something inside the wall was repositioning itself. My grip on Leah's wrist tightened until she should have cried out. She didn't. Her skin was still cold, too cold, and my fingers were numb. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't a word at first. Just a low murmur, a vibration through the wall, close enough that it seemed to come from the air itself. It rose and fell like someone speaking under their breath. The syllables were indistinct, muffled by plaster, but the cadence was unmistakably human. My stomach turned. Leah's face changed again, fear, pure and sharp. She tore her wrist from my grip with a sudden jerk and stumbled backward, away from the wall. She looked at me like she wanted me to do something, to fix it, to be in control again. The murmur stopped. For one suspended second, the room was perfectly silent. Even the building noises seemed to pause. Then the baseboard gap widened. Not physically widening like wood bending, but the darkness behind it seemed to push forward, as if the space inside the wall was deeper than it should be. I saw something pale shift in there, too quick to identify. A hand? A face? My brain refused to settle on an image. It felt like looking at something through water. Leah made a small sound in her throat, half sob, half gag. I lunged forward and slammed the baseboard back into place with my palm. The wood snapped into its groove. My hand stung. The murmur returned instantly, louder, angry now, a vibration that made my teeth ache. Leah backed toward the doorway, shaking. "It's mad," she whispered. "It's mad." "Get out," I said, and my voice sounded foreign in my own ears. I grabbed her elbow, not her wrist this time, and pulled her toward the hall. She resisted for a second, her feet sliding on the floor like she was being pulled in two directions. Then she stumbled with me out of the room. I slammed the second bedroom door shut. The handle rattled in my hand as if someone on the other side had grabbed it at the same moment. I yanked my hand away and backed down the hall, dragging Leah with me. We reached the living room. I turned on every light. The apartment looked exactly as it always did. Couch, coffee table, our half-unpacked boxes. The normality was obscene. Leah collapsed onto the couch, curling in on herself. Her breathing was ragged. I knelt in front of her and tried to catch her gaze. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." She shook her head violently. "No," she whispered. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," I said. "We can't stay." Her eyes flicked toward the hallway. "It knows where we are," she said. "It knows our names." A sound came from the hallway wall. A single, slow knock followed by another, closer to the living room than before. Leah's hands flew to her ears. I stood, my vision narrowing, and went toward the front door. My fingers shook so hard the key scraped against the lock. I turned it anyway. The deadbolt clicked. The chain slid. The door opened a few inches onto the dark hallway outside our apartment. The hallway beyond was empty. No footsteps. No shadow. Just the dull light from the stairwell and the closed doors of other apartments. The silence felt staged, like a room that's been prepared to look empty. I opened the door wider and stepped out, forcing myself to breathe. Our neighbor's door across the hall was slightly ajar. I froze. We'd never spoken to the neighbor across the hall. I'd barely even seen that door open. Now there was a thin black line of space between the door and the frame, like someone had left it unlatched. The air in the hall smelled faintly metallic. I stared at that gap and felt the same instinct I'd felt with the baseboard, that something was behind it, listening. "Come on," I said, turning back into our apartment. "We're going." Leah stood slowly, unsteady on her feet. She walked toward the door like a sleepwalker. I grabbed our keys and her bag without thinking. I didn't bother with shoes. I just wanted out. As we stepped into the hallway, the neighbor's door across from us opened another inch. No hand appeared. No face. Just the door moving, slow, on its hinges. Leah stopped. Her body went rigid, her eyes fixed on the widening darkness. Her mouth opened as if she were about to speak. I pulled her arm. "Leah," I hissed. "Don't." She didn't seem to hear me. The neighbor's door opened another inch. A thin line of light from the hallway slid across the inside of the apartment, revealing nothing but shadow. Then, from inside that shadow, a soft exhale. The same intimate breathing I'd heard behind our wall. My chest tightened so hard I thought I would faint. Leah whispered. It moved. I didn't wait for another second. I yanked her toward the stairwell and we ran, bare feet slapping tile, breath tearing in our throats. The elevator was too slow, too enclosed. The stairs spiraled down, each step echoing. My mind screamed at me to look back to see if something followed. I refused. I kept my eyes on the steps, on the landing, on the exit sign. At the ground floor, the lobby lights buzzed. The air smelled of wet coats and dust. We pushed through the front door into the street rain and kept moving until the building was behind us. Only then did Leah stop. She bent over, hands on her knees, and vomited onto the sidewalk. The sound was harsh, animal. People passed and didn't look. Cars hissed by on wet pavement. The city continued as if nothing had happened. I put my hand on her back. Her skin under my palm was warm now, finally, like a living person. She sobbed once, silently, shoulders shaking. "We're not going back," I said. I said it like a vow, like saying it out loud could make it true. Leah wiped her mouth with her sleeve and looked up at me with red, wet eyes. "It'll come," she whispered. "It doesn't stay in walls. It stays in people." I stared at her, rain on my face, and realized with a sick certainty that leaving the building might not be the same as leaving what had started inside it. The aftermath, we didn't go back that night. We walked until our legs shook and the rain soaked through our clothes, then ducked into a cheap hotel a few blocks from the train station. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and old carpet. The clerk didn't look twice at our bare feet or Leah's shaking hands. He slid a key card across the counter and told us breakfast started at 6. The room was small, aggressively ordinary. Beige walls, a bed bolted to the floor, a bathroom fan that rattled when you turned it on. I locked the door behind us and slid the chain into place, then stood there for a long moment with my forehead against the wood, listening. Nothing. No breathing. No knocks. No sense of pressure in the air. Just the distant sound of traffic and a television murmuring through the wall from the next room. The normal sounds made my chest ache with relief. Leah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. They were trembling now that we'd stopped moving. I knelt in front of her and wrapped her fingers in mine. They were warm. That detail felt important enough to anchor myself to. "You're safe," I said, though I didn't know if it was true. "We're not there anymore." She nodded, but her eyes were unfocused, like she was still listening to something far away. "It's quieter," she whispered. "It hates noise." That sentence sat between us like a live wire. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't want more information. I wanted distance. She showered while I sat on the bed, flinching every time the pipes rattled. When she came out wrapped in a thin towel, her skin was pink from the hot water. The scratches on her ribs were still there, angry and raised. but they looked like injuries now, not symbols. I handed her one of my shirts. She put it on and crawled under the covers without speaking. I lay next to her, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. My body refused sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gap behind the baseboard, the way the darkness had seemed to push forward. I listened to Leah's breathing, counting it, terrified of the moment it might change. At some point, exhaustion won. When I woke, pale morning light was leaking through the thin curtains. For one panicked second, I didn't know where I was. Then I smelled the hotel's industrial coffee and heard a door slam down the hall, and the panic loosened its grip. Leah was awake, lying on her side facing me. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in days. There were dark circles beneath them, but the distance was gone. She looked like herself. "I remember," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. "Remember what?" "All of it," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched in the sheets. "Not everything, but enough." I waited. She swallowed. "It started before we moved," she said. "I didn't want to tell you. I thought I was just fraying. At work, sometimes I'd feel like someone was standing too close behind me. I'd turn around and there'd be no one there. I kept thinking if I ignored it, it would stop." She took a breath. The apartment didn't start it. It recognized it. The word sent a chill through me. "Recognized what?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know." Something in me. Something it could use. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that nothing had been using her, that stress and exhaustion and an old building explained everything. But the image of her kneeling by the wall, her hand moving with purpose, cut off the denial before it reached my mouth. "It showed me things," she continued. "Not pictures. Feelings. Like memories without images. I think the woman who lived there before, she didn't leave. Not all of her." My chest tightened. "What happened to her?" Leah's eyes filled. "She stayed too long," she whispered. She listened when it spoke. She thought if she did what it wanted, it would let her rest. I thought of Marino's hurried tour, his laughter on the phone, the way he'd said the woman's name didn't matter. "Did it kill her?" I asked. Leah hesitated. "I don't think it had to. We checked out before noon. I threw away the key card like it could burn me. We sat in a cafe with loud music and too many people and forced ourselves to eat." Leah flinched at sudden sounds, but she stayed present. Every time her gaze drifted, she brought it back with visible effort, like someone pulling themselves out of deep water. We didn't go back to the apartment. I emailed Marino and told him there was a family emergency and we were vacating immediately. I didn't ask for the deposit. I didn't want a reason to return. He replied hours later with a single line, "You still owe notice." I never answered. We stayed with friends for a while, then with my sister. Leah took time off work. I told my clients I needed to pause projects. The practical fallout piled up, lost money, awkward explanations, the logistics of rebuilding a life from bags and borrowed rooms. But none of it mattered compared to the simple fact that we were not behind those walls anymore. For a few weeks, it felt like we'd escaped. Then the small things started again. Not the breathing, not the smells, just the sense of being watched, sharpened and focused, like a finger pressed between my shoulder blades. It happened in crowded places now, which made it harder to dismiss. Leah would stop mid-step and look around, her face tightening. She'd whisper, "It's farther away," or "It's learning." We saw a doctor, then another. Blood tests, sleep studies. Words like anxiety and trauma and shared stress were offered carefully, like fragile objects. Medication dulled the edges but didn't erase the center. Therapy gave Leah language for what she was feeling, but not a way to stop feeling it. She stopped standing in doorways. She stopped waking at night. But sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd press her palm flat against a wall and close her eyes, listening. I asked her once what she heard. "Space," she said. "Just space." We moved again to a newer building with thick walls and bright lights and neighbors who made too much noise. I insisted on background sound at all times. Music, television, a fan running. Silence made my skin crawl. Leah didn't argue. Months passed. The scratches faded. The bruises stopped appearing. Leah laughed again, cautiously at first, like she was testing whether it was allowed. Some days she was almost entirely herself. Almost. Every now and then she'd wake from a dream and grab my arm hard enough to hurt. "It was calling," she'd whisper, and I'd hold her until she fell back asleep, my eyes open, scanning the room for corners that felt too dark. I started to understand something I hadn't before, that places don't have to be haunted to hurt you. Sometimes they're just thin. Sometimes they press on the wrong person at the wrong time and leave an imprint that doesn't fade when you move away. We never reported what we found in that wall. I don't know what happened to the apartment after we left. Part of me is afraid to find out. Part of me knows it doesn't matter. Buildings change hands. Walls get repainted. Gaps get sealed. Whatever was there doesn't need the apartment anymore. It learned Leia's shape. It learned her rhythms. It learned how to stand close without being seen. And some nights, when the world is quiet enough, I feel it paying attention again, patient as ever, waiting for us to forget why noise matters. Story 2. We bought a vintage doll. Introduction. I used to think the worst things that could happen to a family happened loudly. A phone call in the middle of the night. A crash you could hear from another room. A doctor's voice that turns careful and slow. I thought fear always arrived with a reason you could point at. A shape you could name. The first time my daughter spoke to the doll, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like one of those harmless moments you tell friends about later, smiling. The way parents collect strange little sentences, the way they collect drawings on the fridge. It felt like a story with soft edges. Her name is Nora. She was 4 at the time, small enough that her shoes still flashed when she walked, old enough to argue about bedtimes with an exhausting seriousness. She had the kind of imagination that made ordinary rooms feel busy. She talked to stuffed animals, to the bathtub bubbles, to the dark rectangle of the TV when it was off. My wife, Elise, and I encouraged it in the usual ways. We listened, we nodded, we answered her questions even when they didn't make sense. We were tired most days, but we were steady, and we trusted the small rituals that kept the house calm. Dinner at the same time, bath before bed, one story, then lights out. The doll came from a vintage shop on a side street we didn't normally walk down. We had been killing time on a Saturday afternoon. The kind where the light looks washed and the air smells faintly of rain even when it isn't raining. Elise wanted coffee. Nora wanted to stop at every window display. I wanted to get home before the groceries warmed in the bag. We turned a corner, and there it was. A narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign and a window crowded with objects that looked like they belonged to someone else's memories. Old postcards, a cracked mirror, a brass lamp with a dented shade, the metal slightly tarnished where fingers had touched it too many times. Nora pressed her hands to the glass. Her breath fogged a circle in the window. "Look," she said, and her voice took on that sharp focus she got when she decided something was hers before it was. Inside, the shop smelled like dust and old paper and a sweet note underneath, like dried flowers sealed in a book. The floorboards creaked in a way that made you step carefully without meaning to. The air was warmer than outside, thick, unmoving. A bell over the door had rung when we entered, but after that, the place seemed to swallow sound. Even Nora's sneakers were quieter on the wood than they should have been. The owner came out from behind a curtain in the back. He was older, thin, wearing a cardigan that looked too heavy for the season. He nodded once, not quite a greeting, more like an acknowledgement that we had entered his space and he would allow it. His eyes moved over us quickly, and when they landed on Nora, they lingered a beat too long before shifting away. Nora moved straight to a shelf near the counter. She didn't wander. She didn't hesitate. She reached up with both hands and pointed, then turned her head toward Elise the way she did when she wanted backup. It was a doll about the length of Nora's forearm. Fabric body, head made of something harder, painted maybe, or carved and varnished. The face was simple but not cute. Small mouth, Dark eyes that weren't glassy the way modern dolls are, but dull, like ink sealed under a layer of clear coating. The dress was a faded blue with tiny buttons. The hair was yarn, pale blonde, slightly matted at the ends. I remember noticing how clean it was compared to everything else. Not new, just cared for. Like someone had wiped it down recently, paying attention to the seams, the folds of the dress, the edges of the painted face. It sat among dusty objects like it didn't belong to the same decay. "Elise," I said quietly, because I could already see the conversation starting in Nora's expression. The pleading certainty, the way her shoulders lifted when she thought she'd found the thing. We had a rule about bringing home random toys, especially old ones, and we followed it most of the time. But rules bend when you're standing in a shop and your child looks at something like it's calling her name. Elise crouched beside Nora and smiled. "It's pretty," she said, in the careful tone of a parent deciding whether a purchase is worth the aftermath. Nora didn't look at her. She kept staring at the doll. "She's been waiting," Nora said. The sentence made me laugh at first, a short breath through my nose. Kids say odd things. They borrow words. They imitate adults. I looked at the shop owner to see if he reacted, if he'd heard. He was watching Nora with an expression that was almost blank. Not pleased. Not surprised. Just still. Then he cleared his throat once, like someone remembering he was supposed to participate. "That one," he said, "has been here a long time." "How long?" Elise asked. He shrugged. "Years." That should have been enough to make us put it back. It wasn't. We were already standing in the shop, already imagining Nora quiet in the car because she had what she wanted. Elise asked the price. The owner named a number that was low enough to feel like a bargain and high enough to feel deliberate. Elise hesitated. Nora's fingers tightened around the doll's fabric body, as if she was afraid someone would take it away. "Do you like it?" Elise asked Nora. Nora nodded once hard. "She likes me," she said. We paid. The owner wrapped the doll in brown paper with a piece of twine as if it was fragile. His hands were steady. He didn't offer a receipt unless Elise asked. When she did, he wrote it slowly, his handwriting small and careful, and slid the paper across the counter without meeting our eyes. I noticed his nails were clean and cut short, like he took pride in details. As we left, the bell rang again, and the sound felt too bright in the stale air, like it belonged outside instead of in that room. Outside, the street felt louder. Cars, voices, wind. Elise held Nora's hand, and Nora held the doll's wrapped body against her chest with her other arm, like a secret she couldn't risk dropping. That evening, after dinner, Nora carried the doll from room to room. She sat it on the couch. She sat it on the kitchen chair. She placed it carefully on her bed, propped against a pillow. She asked Elise to help her untie the twine. When the paper fell away, Nora stroked the doll's yarn hair once and whispered something I couldn't hear, her mouth close to the doll's painted ear. Elise and I exchanged a look across the doorway. We'd both heard enough bedtime monologues to know when to tune out and when to pay attention. This didn't feel like attention yet. It felt like ordinary play. It felt like an object becoming part of a child's world. "What's her name?" Elise asked. Nora didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, eyes on the doll as if waiting. Her face went still in that way children get when they're listening hard, not to you, but to something they've decided is important. Then she said, "She says it's Clara." I watched Nora's face as she said it. There was no smirk, no pause that suggested she'd invented it. She said it with the same certainty she used when she said the sky was blue or she didn't like carrots. Elise smiled and nodded like it was normal, because parents do that. They build the child's world by accepting it, by reinforcing the rules of make-believe so the child feels seen. That night I woke to hear Nora talking in her room. Not crying. Not calling for us. Just talking, soft, rhythmic, like reciting something. The kind of talking that has an audience. I lay still for a moment, listening through the wall. Our apartment was small and sounds traveled. I could hear Elise's breathing beside me, deep and steady. I could hear the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. Under it, Nora's voice, low and calm, the syllables sliding into each other. I couldn't make out the words, and that made it worse, because it meant my brain tried to supply them. I got up and walked to her door. The hallway was dark. The air felt cooler there than in our bedroom. I remember thinking the floorboards were colder under my bare feet than they should have been, like the building held onto nighttime in the corridor. Nora's door was cracked open a few inches. A thin wedge of light from her nightlight spilled into the hall. I pushed it wider with my fingertips. Nora sat up in bed, the blanket gathered around her waist. The doll was propped against her knees. Her head was bent toward it in that serious way she got when she was concentrating. Her lips were moving. I whispered her name. She looked up at me, startled but not scared, as if I'd interrupted a game. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth from the blankets. Her eyes were alert. "It's late," I said, keeping my voice soft so I wouldn't wake Elise. "You need to sleep." Nora nodded as if she understood, but her eyes kept flicking down to the doll. "Clara doesn't like when you stand in the doorway," she said. The sentence touched something in me that felt physical, like a small cold finger pressed against the inside of my ribs. I forced myself to smile. "Clara doesn't decide that," I said, trying to make it playful. "I decide it. Put her down and close your eyes." Nora's mouth tightened. She looked offended on the doll's behalf. "She said you're too loud," Nora whispered. I felt my scalp prickle. The nightlight made soft shapes on the walls. Nora's face looked pale in it, her eyes too bright. The doll's dark painted eyes reflected nothing. "Okay," I said, because it was easier than arguing with a child at midnight. "I'll be quiet. Sleep." I pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it open the way we always did. As I walked back to bed, I told myself it was nothing. Kids pick up tones. They project. They test power. The doll was just an object Nora had decided was alive, and the rest was imagination. In the morning, Nora didn't mention the conversation. She ate cereal and asked to watch cartoons. Elise kissed her forehead and asked if she slept well. Nora nodded, cheerful. The doll sat at the corner of the kitchen table, facing us, as if it had been placed there on purpose. I picked it up to move it aside so I could wipe the table. The fabric body felt heavier than it looked. Not by much, just enough that my fingers registered it. The doll's head was cool and smooth, like something that had been kept in a cellar or a drawer away from sunlight. I set it on the counter and noticed something else. A faint smell, like old perfume trapped in cloth. Powdery. Sweet. Not strong, but present, like it clung to the stitching and released slowly when you disturbed it. When Elise noticed me sniffing, she laughed quietly. "It's vintage," she said. "Of course it smells old," I nodded. I wanted to agree. I wanted to keep it in the category of ordinary. But as the days went on, Nora stopped calling it a doll. She called it Clara, like Clara was a person who happened to be small. And Nora began to listen to it before she listened to us. Marque background before Clara, the strangest part of our life was how normal it was. Elise and I had been together long enough to stop pretending we were effortless. We had the quiet logistics of adulthood, calendars on the fridge, a shared notes app full of errands, the constant little negotiations about who would pick Nora up, who would cook, who would answer the late email. Elise worked in an office that looked modern from the outside and felt fluorescent and airless on the inside. I freelanced, mostly remote work, sometimes a contract that required me to sit in someone else's conference room and nod at people who didn't know what my actual job was. We weren't rich, but we were stable. We argued about small things, laundry, dishes, whether we should buy the good olive oil, and then we apologized and moved on. Our stress had the shape of ordinary life. Our apartment was on the second floor of a building that had been renovated just enough to feel clean. The walls were thin in the ordinary way. You could hear a neighbor's shower through the plumbing sometimes. You could hear the elevator cable hum if the building was quiet enough. But nothing about it felt threatening. It smelled like laundry detergent and cooking oil from other apartments. The hallway lights were bright and reliable. The windows didn't stick. Nora had her own room, small but hers. We painted one wall a soft green because she liked frogs. Elise hung Nora's drawings with little clips. I built a low bookshelf so she could reach her own books. Most nights, when I put her to bed, she'd insist on arranging her stuffed animals in a specific order: bear, rabbit, the cat with one missing eye. She narrated it as she did it, explaining their jobs for the night. I'd listen, half amused, half grateful, because it meant she felt safe enough to be silly. That was always the context for her imagination. Safe. So when she began talking to the doll in a way that sounded like an actual conversation, our first instinct wasn't panic. It was the same tired patience we'd used for everything else. Elise would smile and say, "What is Clara telling you?" I would roll my eyes and say, "Clara has opinions, huh?" Nora would answer with the seriousness of a tiny person carrying important information. It stayed in that harmless category for a while. The vintage shop, though, did not stay in my mind as harmless. In the days after we bought the doll, I found myself replaying details I hadn't cared about in the moment. The way the owner's eyes had lingered on Nora. The way he'd wrapped the doll like it needed protection. The way the shop's air had felt warmer and heavier than it should have. I told myself that was just my brain doing what brains do, turning something odd into something meaningful after the fact. Elise didn't think about it at all. If she noticed the shop owner's behavior, she filed it away and moved on. That was Elise's strength. She didn't feed anxieties. She didn't build castles out of what if. She grounded herself in what she could touch. And for a while, Clara was just something we could touch. Nora carried the doll everywhere. She buckled it into the car seat beside her. She sat it at the table. She insisted it have its own small plate, even if the plate stayed empty. She made Elise tuck it in on the pillow next to her before bed, the doll's painted eyes aimed toward the door. At first, that was almost sweet. Then the details got specific. Nora began to tell us things Clara didn't like. She didn't like the hallway light left on. She didn't like the bathroom door closed. She didn't like the sound of the dishwasher at night. These were ordinary preferences if you framed them as a child being difficult. But the way Nora delivered them was different. There was no whining, no bargaining. She would simply state them, flat and certain, as if she was repeating instructions. One evening, Elise was chopping vegetables while Nora sat on the kitchen floor making a house out of blocks. The doll sat upright in the corner of the little block room like a queen. Elise asked Nora if she wanted carrots or peas with dinner. Nora didn't look up. She said, "Clara says not to use the big knife." Elise paused, hand still on the knife handle. She looked at me with an expression that was half amusement, half warning. "Don't turn this into a thing." I shrugged, trying to keep my face neutral. Elise switched to the smaller knife without comment, because that's what you do when you don't want to argue with a child, and you also don't want to admit you've been unsettled. After dinner, Elise mentioned it casually, like she was smoothing a wrinkle. "She's mimicking," she said. "Kids do that." She heard me say the big knife is sharp. I wanted to agree, but Nora hadn't heard Elise say that. We didn't talk about knives around her. We didn't dramatize kitchen safety. We just kept the sharp things out of reach and moved on. The next day, I found the doll in our bedroom. I didn't put it there. Elise didn't put it there. Nora was at daycare. The doll sat on our bed, propped against my pillow, as if it had been placed carefully in the center of the room. Its dress was smoothed flat, its yarn hair brushed to one side. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, my skin prickling. Then I did what adults do when something makes no sense. I looked for an ordinary explanation. Maybe Nora had brought it in that morning and I hadn't noticed. Maybe Elise had moved it while making the bed. Maybe I was losing track of small details because I was stressed. I carried it back to Nora's room and set it on her shelf. The doll's head was cool again, like it hadn't been warmed by a body. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard Nora whispering in her room. I listened without meaning to. It sounded like the same cadence as the first night, soft, rhythmic, low. The kind of voice you use when you don't want to be overheard. When I opened her door, she was lying on her side with the blanket pulled up to her chin, the doll tucked into the crook of her arm like a sleeping baby. Her eyes were open. "What were you saying?" I asked gently. Nora blinked slowly. "Clara was telling me about the shop," she said. My throat tightened. "What about the shop?" Nora's gaze slid past me to the hallway, then back. "She said she didn't like it there." she whispered. She said it was too crowded, too noisy, too many hands. I felt a thin coldness run through my chest, as if someone had opened a window behind my ribs. Who had hands? I asked, immediately regretting that I'd followed the thread. Nora frowned like I was being slow. People, she said. She said they touched her face. There was no childish embellishment, no theatrical shiver, just a plain report. I told myself it was a story, something Nora had invented out of the shop's clutter, something she'd absorbed from a cartoon. I told myself the same thing I'd told myself the first night, imagination. But as I stood in her doorway, I realized something else. Nora's room smelled faintly of that powdery sweetness I'd noticed on the doll's cloth. The smell clung to the air like perfume, thin but persistent. When I went back to bed, Elise was awake. She asked why I'd been gone so long. I told her Nora was talking again. Elise sighed and rubbed her eyes. It's the doll, she said. She'll get bored of it. What if she doesn't? I asked. Elise turned on her side to face me. In the dark, I could only see the outline of her cheek and the shine of her eyes. Then we take it away, she said, practical, firm. It's a toy. I wanted her certainty. I wanted to put everything back into categories: toy, child, imagination. But when I closed my eyes, I saw the doll on my pillow, placed like a message, and I felt my body refusing to relax. On the third day after the purchase, Nora came home from daycare unusually quiet. She moved through the apartment with her shoes still on, holding Clara close against her chest, her chin tucked down. Elise asked what was wrong. Nora didn't answer at first. She walked to the living room, set the doll on the couch, and stood in front of it like she was waiting for instructions. Then she said, Clara says we should close the blinds before it gets dark. Elise laughed, a small, tired laugh. Why? Nora looked at her with a seriousness that made Elise's laughter fade. Because people can see in, Nora said. Elise glanced at the windows, then back at Nora. No one is looking in, sweetheart. Nora's eyes stayed fixed. Clara says they did before, she whispered. That was the moment I felt the story shift. Not into something impossible, not into something I could label as supernatural. Into something worse. Something that felt like it had been lived before, like it carried memory. I got up and closed the blinds anyway. The fabric rasped against the frame. The room darkened to shade. Nora relaxed visibly, her shoulders dropping as if she'd been holding herself tight. Elise looked at me, annoyed. I could see the accusation in her face. You're feeding it. You're encouraging it. Maybe I was. But the air felt different with the blinds closed. Not safer, just quieter. Like we'd agreed to a rule we didn't understand. And that night, when Nora spoke to Clara again, her voice wasn't playful. It sounded like she was answering questions. There were first irregularities. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They came in small, almost polite adjustments. The kind you don't question because questioning them would mean admitting something fundamental had shifted. Nora began waking earlier than usual. Not crying, not calling for us, just awake. When Elise or I went to check on her, she'd be sitting up in bed with Clara in her lap, her small fingers combing through the doll's yarn hair with slow, repetitive movements. Her eyes would be open and calm, like she'd been awake for a long time already. How long have you been up? Elise asked one morning, her voice still thick with sleep. Nora shrugged. Clara woke me, she said. Elise smiled weakly. Dolls don't wake people. Nora didn't argue. She just looked down at Clara and nodded, as if acknowledging a correction that didn't change anything. The mornings developed a pattern. Nora would eat without complaint, dress without being asked twice, move through her routines with a precision that didn't match her age. She stopped humming to herself. She stopped narrating her games. Instead, she'd pause often, head tilted slightly, listening. When Elise asked what she was listening to, Nora would say, nothing, in a tone that meant the opposite. The doll stopped staying in Nora's room. We'd find Clara sitting in different places throughout the apartment, upright on the armchair, centered on the dining table, facing the hallway from the end of the couch. Always placed deliberately, never slumped or dropped. Its dress was always smoothed, its hair always arranged. I asked Elise if she'd moved it. She shook her head. I thought you did. We asked Nora. She looked genuinely confused. Clara goes where she wants, she said, like that was the end of the explanation. I began paying attention to where the doll appeared. It favored thresholds, doorways, the narrow strip of floor where the hallway opened into the living room. Once I found it sitting just inside the bathroom door, angled so its painted eyes faced the mirror. That one made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. The smell followed it. That faint powdery sweetness, like old perfume, seemed strongest wherever Clara sat. It wasn't overwhelming. It was subtle enough that you could convince yourself you were imagining it. But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop tracking it. When the doll moved, the smell moved with it, lingering faintly after it was gone, like warmth on a chair after someone stands up. Nora began repeating phrases that didn't sound like hers. They weren't dramatic. They weren't obviously sinister. They were small adult statements delivered in a child's voice, stripped of emotion. One afternoon, Elise was on a work call in the bedroom. The door closed. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes. Nora sat at the table with crayons, Clara propped beside her. Without looking up, Nora said, "Clara says not to use the big knife." My hands froze under the running water. "Why?" I asked. "Because it wakes her," Nora replied. "Who?" Nora frowned. "The lady," she said, and then after a pause added, "the one who doesn't sleep." I shut off the tap slowly. The apartment felt too quiet. Elise's muffled voice drifted through the wall, distorted by distance and drywall. I wanted to tell myself Nora had overheard something, maybe a story at daycare, maybe a phrase from a show, but the words didn't fit her usual vocabulary. They felt borrowed. That evening, Elise admitted something she'd been keeping to herself. "I hear Nora talking when I'm not in the room," she said quietly, as we stood in the kitchen after Nora had gone to bed. The overhead light hummed faintly. Not playing, talking. And when I check, she stops. I leaned against the counter, my pulse loud in my ears. "What does she say?" Elise shook her head. "I can't hear the words, just the tone. Like she's answering questions." That phrase landed between us, heavy and specific. The nights grew worse. Nora started waking in the middle of the night and leaving her room. We didn't know at first. We discovered it through absence. I woke one night and rolled over to check the time, the glow from my phone lighting the ceiling. Elise was asleep beside me. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I listened, heart thudding, and realized I couldn't hear the faint white noise of Nora's nightlight fan through the wall. I got up and walked to her room. Her bed was empty. The blanket was folded back neatly, like she'd climbed out carefully, not tossed it aside in sleep. Clara was gone too. I moved through the apartment quietly, my bare feet soundless on the floor. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. The bathroom light was on. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter sit on the closed toilet lid, her feet dangling above the floor. Clara sat on the sink counter facing her. Nora's hands were folded in her lap. Her posture was straight, attentive. She was listening. I whispered her name. She turned toward me slowly, as if rotating on a hinge. Her eyes were open and clear. She didn't look frightened. She looked annoyed. "You weren't supposed to hear," she said. My throat went dry. "Hear what?" She glanced at Clara, then back at me. "Nothing," she said too quickly. I scooped her up without thinking, holding her close against my chest. Her body was warm. Her heartbeat was steady. She smelled like shampoo and that faint powdery scent underneath. Elise woke when I brought Nora into our bed. Nora fell asleep almost immediately, curled against Elise's side. Elise stroked her hair and whispered, "What happened?" "She was in the bathroom," I said. "Talking to the doll." Elise went still. In the dim light, I saw her jaw tighten. "We need to take it away," she said. "In the morning we tried." Elise told Nora gently that Clara needed to rest on the shelf for a while. Nora listened without interrupting, her face blank. When Elise finished, Nora nodded once. "She says that's not allowed," Nora said. Elise crouched to Nora's level. "Who says?" Nora's gaze slid toward the hallway, then back. "Clara," she said, "and the lady." Elise stood up abruptly. "Okay," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "Enough!" She reached for the doll. The moment her fingers touched Clara's fabric body, Nora screamed. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't anger. It was raw panic, a sound torn from deep in her chest. She clutched at Elise's arm, sobbing, her small body shaking violently. "Don't!" Nora cried. "She'll be cold. She'll be alone." Elise released the doll immediately, shocked. I pulled Nora into my arms, my own heart racing. She clung to me like she was drowning, her face buried in my shoulder, her breath coming in sharp gasps. We backed down. That afternoon, Elise suggested we return the doll to the shop. The idea settled over us like a plan you don't want to examine too closely. We told ourselves it was reasonable. The doll upset Nora. That was enough justification. But when Elise reached for her phone to look up the shop's hours, she froze. "It's gone," she said. "What is?" "The shop," she replied, scrolling. "It's not on the map anymore." I checked on my phone. The listing that had been there days before, complete with a grainy photo of the storefront, was gone. No address. No reviews. Nothing. I told myself businesses close all the time. Listings disappear. The internet forgets. But that evening, as we ate dinner in a dimmer room than usual, blinds closed, lights low, Nora looked up suddenly and said, "Clara says you shouldn't try to take her back." Elise's fork clattered against her plate. "Why?" she asked, too sharply. Nora swallowed. "Because she doesn't belong there anymore," she whispered. "She belongs where the lady is." My skin prickled. "And where is that?" Nora's eyes drifted toward the hallway again, toward the dark stretch of floor outside her bedroom. "Here," she said. That night, the apartment didn't feel like ours. It felt occupied. Bree, escalating tension. After that night, Elise stopped leaving Nora alone with Clara. Not consciously at first. It was just a shift in behavior that neither of us named. Elise would bring Nora into the kitchen if she needed to shower. I would pause work calls if I heard Nora's voice change tone in the other room. We began moving as a unit without discussing it, like animals that sense pressure in the environment and adjust their spacing accordingly. Nora noticed. She stopped asking to be alone. That was the first thing that felt truly wrong. Before Clara, Nora guarded her independence fiercely. She wanted to play in her room by herself. She wanted the door half closed. She wanted privacy in the small, declarative way only children do. Now, she followed Elise from room to room, holding the doll against her chest, her small fingers curled into the fabric like she was afraid it might slip away if she relaxed. If Elise asked her why she didn't want to stay in her room, Nora would say, "Clara doesn't like the quiet anymore." "What does she like?" Elise asked once, trying to keep her tone light. Nora thought for a moment. "Listening," she said. The apartment developed a new rhythm. Doors stayed open. Lights stayed on longer than necessary. The television hummed in the background even when no one was watching. Silence felt dangerous now, like a thin surface that could break if we put too much weight on it. And still things happened. I began to wake at night with the certainty that someone was standing in the room. Not a dream. Not sleep paralysis. I would open my eyes fully alert, my heart already racing, and feel the unmistakable pressure of presence. The air near the foot of the bed felt heavier, colder. I'd hold my breath and listen. There was never anything there. Elise started sleeping poorly too. She'd toss and turn, then sit up abruptly, her hand pressed to her chest. When I asked what woke her, she said she didn't know. Just that she'd felt watched. Nora slept deeply through it all. Too deeply. Sometimes I would stand in her doorway at night and watch her chest rise and fall, slow and even, Clara tucked under her arm. The doll's painted eyes stared outward, fixed on the door, as if guarding the room. The faint scent of old perfume was strongest there, clinging to the air until my nose ached with it. One night I moved the doll. I didn't tell Elise. I waited until Nora was asleep, then lifted Clara gently from her arm. Nora didn't stir. I carried the doll into the living room and placed it on the highest shelf we had, tucked behind a row of books. The fabric felt colder than the surrounding air. When I set it down, I had the brief, irrational impression that it resisted, like a magnet pulling against another surface. I went back to bed and lay awake, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. I almost felt foolish. Until morning. Nora woke screaming. Not crying, screaming sharp and sustained like an alarm. Elise and I ran to her room together. Nora sat upright in bed, her face red, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her hands were empty. "She's gone," Nora sobbed. "She can't breathe." "She's alone." Elise scooped her up, murmuring comfort. I stood frozen for a moment, guilt twisting in my stomach. "I just moved her," I said quietly. "She's still here." Nora's head snapped toward me. Her expression was not that of a frightened child. It was fury. "She said not to!" Nora screamed. "She said not to move her." Elise stared at me. I could see the accusation there, raw and unfiltered. "What did you do?" I retrieved the doll and returned it to Nora's bed. The moment Clara was back in her arms, Nora's screaming stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. She hiccuped once, then went still, clutching the doll tightly, her breath evening out as if nothing had happened. Elise looked at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. That was the day we stopped pretending it was just a phase. We began searching for explanations we could live with. Elise suggested a child psychologist. I suggested sleep disorders, night terrors, stress responses. We read articles late at night, screens glowing in the dark bedroom. Shared psychosis, projection, attachment objects. None of the words fit cleanly. They felt like labels stuck onto something that didn't want to be named. We made an appointment anyway. The doctor was calm, attentive. She asked Nora questions about school, friends, favorite games. Nora answered politely, briefly. When the doctor asked about Clara, Nora brightened. "She listens," Nora said. "She remembers things." "What things?" the doctor asked. Nora tilted her head. "The house," she said. "The way it was before." The doctor glanced at Elise and me, her expression neutral but alert. "What do you mean before?" she asked. Nora frowned. "Before we were here," she said. "Before you fixed it." Elise inhaled sharply. The appointment ended with suggestions and follow-ups and careful language. Nothing definitive. Nothing that explained why my daughter sometimes woke with faint red marks on her arms, like pressure impressions that faded by afternoon. Nothing that explained why the hallway outside Nora's room felt colder at night, or why the air seemed to thicken there, like the apartment was holding its breath. Things escalated quietly after that. Nora began to speak in her sleep. Not words. Names. I heard it one night while Elise was in the shower. I stood in the hallway, listening to Nora's voice drift through the thin door. She murmured softly, rhythmically, repeating the same sound over and over. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't gibberish. It was a woman's name. Not Clara. A longer name, one I didn't recognize, pronounced carefully, like it mattered to get it right. When I opened the door, Nora fell silent instantly. Her eyes stayed closed. Clara lay against her chest, unmoving. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling. The next morning, Elise found muddy footprints on the bathroom tile. Small ones. Bare feet. They led from the hallway to the sink and stopped there, as if Nora had stood perfectly still for a long time. We asked Nora if she'd been up during the night. She shook her head. "Clara went," she said. That afternoon, Elise cried for the first time since this had started. Not loudly. Just sitting at the kitchen table with her hands pressed flat against the wood, her shoulders shaking. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't know how to protect her from something I can't see." I didn't have an answer. That night, the power went out. Not the whole building. Just our apartment. The lights cut abruptly, the hum of appliances dying mid-breath. The apartment plunged into darkness so complete it felt physical. Elise swore softly. Nora gasped. In the dark, Nora laughed. It was a small sound. Soft. Almost pleased. "She likes it," Nora said. The hallway felt colder than ever. The smell of old perfume thickened, sweet and suffocating. And from somewhere just outside Nora's room, I heard something else. A slow, deliberate sound, like fabric dragging gently across the floor. The critical incident. When the lights went out, time lost its usual shape. At first I thought it was a breaker, something mundane. The refrigerator died mid-hum. The digital clock on the microwave went black. The silence that followed was abrupt and wrong. like the apartment had been unplugged from the world. Outside, through the windows, the city still glowed faintly. Streetlights worked. A car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the walls. This wasn't a blackout. It was just us. "Elise," I said quietly, reaching for my phone in my pocket. The screen lit up, harsh and white, casting our shadows long and distorted against the walls. There was no signal drop. Everything worked. That made it worse. Nora stood very still in the living room, Clara tucked under her arm. Her head was tilted slightly toward the hallway, her expression attentive. Not scared. Expectant. "Stay here," Elise whispered to me, her voice shaking despite the effort to control it. She took a step toward Nora, reaching out. "Sweetheart, come sit with us." Nora didn't move. "She's coming," Nora said softly. The smell thickened. That powdery sweetness filled my mouth, coated my tongue, made my throat feel tight. It was strongest near the hallway, spilling out of it like fog. Then I heard it again. The sound was unmistakable now. Something soft dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, moving toward us. Not footsteps. No heel strike. No weight shift. Just a continuous whisper of fabric against wood, advancing inch by inch. My phone light shook in my hand as I aimed it down the hallway. The beam cut through the darkness and caught the far wall, the closed door of Nora's room, the bathroom door ajar. Nothing else. The sound continued. Closer. Elise's fingers dug into my arm. I could feel her nails through my shirt. Her breathing came in short, sharp pulls. "Nora," she whispered, barely louder than air. "Please." Nora turned her head toward Elise slowly, as if it took effort. "You said she could stay," she replied. "You brought her home." My chest tightened. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer I didn't want. Nora smiled. It was not a child's smile. "She says her name doesn't matter anymore," Nora said. "She says you fixed the walls, but you didn't listen." The dragging sound reached the edge of the living room. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of my face. The phone light trembled as it swept lower, catching the baseboards, the seams between floorboards. The shadows there looked deeper, thicker, like they had weight. Then something moved. Not fully into the light, just enough to be undeniable. The edge of fabric, pale and worn, slid into view from the hallway. It brushed the corner of the wall, hesitated, then advanced another inch. The cloth looked like a dress hem, old-fashioned, the weave tight, the color washed almost to gray. Elise gasped. A strangled sound she couldn't stop. Nora stepped forward. I reacted without thinking. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward us. Her skin was cold. Not chilled, cold like she'd been standing outside in winter. She fought me with surprising strength, twisting in my grip, her small body rigid. "She needs it," Nora cried. "She needs me to hold it open." "What?" Elise sobbed. "Nora, please." The fabric surged forward. The phone light flickered as if it had passed through something dense. For a fraction of a second, the beam revealed more, a suggestion of a shape above the dragging hem, a vertical distortion in the air like heat shimmer but wrong, bent inward instead of rising. The smell became unbearable. I gagged, my eyes watering. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to scoop Nora up and flee, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Nora screamed again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was effort. "She's stuck," Nora cried. "She can't fit. She needs my voice." The air vibrated. I felt it in my teeth, in the bones of my skull, a low pressure like standing too close to heavy machinery. The hallway darkened further, the shadows folding inward, collapsing on themselves. Elise broke. She lunged forward and ripped Clara from Nora's arms. The moment her fingers closed around the doll, the pressure spiked. The lights overhead shattered in a spray of glass. Elise screamed and dropped the doll. It hit the floor and rolled, stopping on its side, its painted eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The dragging sound stopped. Everything went silent. For one long, unbearable second, nothing moved. Then the smell rushed toward us in a wave, hot and suffocating, and the fabric snapped back into the hallway as if yanked by an unseen force. The darkness there recoiled, compressing violently, slamming into the far wall. The power surged back on. Lights blazed. Appliances beeped. The television turned itself on, static hissing. Nora collapsed. I caught her just before she hit the floor. Her body went limp in my arms, heavy and unresponsive. Elise dropped to her knees beside us, sobbing, calling her name over and over. The hallway was empty. No fabric. No distortion. Just our familiar walls, scuffed baseboards, closed doors. The smell dissipated rapidly, thinning until it was barely a trace. Clara lay where it had fallen. The doll's dress was torn at the hem, and its yarn hair was wet. We didn't call the police. We didn't call anyone. I don't know why. Shock, maybe. Some instinct that told us this wasn't something that could be explained without sounding insane. I carried Nora to our bedroom and laid her on the bed. Elise sat beside her, stroking her hair, whispering apologies like prayers. Nora woke an hour later. She didn't cry. She looked around the room slowly, confusion flickering across her face. When Elise asked her what she remembered, Nora frowned. There was a lady, she said. She was tired. She turned her head toward the doorway, then away. She said goodbye. I went back to the living room alone. Clara was gone. Not moved. Gone. No sound. No trace. No smell. Just an empty patch of floor where the doll had been. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over. Whatever had followed us home didn't need the doll anymore. So for aftermath, we left the apartment 2 days later. Not immediately. Not in a rush with sirens and bags half-zipped. We stayed because we didn't know how to explain leaving. Because Nora was exhausted and slept for nearly a full day after the incident. Her small body curled in on itself like she was recovering from a long illness. Because Elise and I were moving through time as if it were thick water, every action delayed by shock. The first night after the lights came back on, we didn't sleep. Nora lay between us in our bed, her breathing deep and even. She didn't ask for Clara. She didn't reach for the empty space where the doll had always been. That absence felt louder than anything else had. I watched her chest rise and fall, counting the seconds between breaths, afraid of what might happen if I stopped paying attention. Elise sat propped against the headboard, her hand resting on Nora's back. Her fingers moved in small, repetitive strokes, like she was afraid that if she stopped touching Nora, something might take advantage of the gap. The apartment felt hollow. Not empty, hollow. Like the walls were shells that had once held something alive and now only remembered the shape of it. The hallway was warmer again, but it didn't feel safe. The smell was gone, completely, and that absence made me uneasy in a new way. I kept expecting it to come back, to announce itself. In the early hours of the morning, Nora stirred. I tensed immediately, my muscles tightening, my heart slamming into motion. Elise froze beside me. Nora opened her eyes and looked around the room, unfocused at first. Then her gaze settled on the doorway. I held my breath. "She's not here," Nora murmured. Elise swallowed hard. "Who isn't, sweetheart?" Nora frowned slightly, like she was trying to remember a word that had slipped away. "The lady," she said. She went somewhere quiet. I waited for the fear to hit her, for confusion or distress. It didn't come. Nora yawned, turned onto her side, and fell back asleep within seconds. Elise pressed her face into her free hand and cried silently. The next day, Nora acted like a child again. She asked for pancakes. She complained about her socks. She watched cartoons and laughed at things that weren't funny. She didn't mention Clara unless prompted, and when Elise asked gently where she thought the doll had gone, Nora shrugged. "She finished," she said. That was all. I packed our things while Elise made phone calls. To her sister. To her boss. To our landlord. She kept the explanations vague, her voice tight but controlled. Family emergency. Temporary relocation. We'll talk about the lease later. I avoided Nora's room. When I finally forced myself to go in to gather her clothes, the room felt wrong in a different way. Lighter. Like something heavy had been removed. The shelf where Clara had sat was bare, a faint outline of dust marking where the doll's body had blocked the light. I wiped it away with my sleeve and felt a strange, irrational anger at how easily it disappeared. We didn't find Clara. We checked everywhere. Inside drawers. Under furniture. In the trash chute, in the hallway outside our door. There was no sign she had ever been there, except in Nora's memory and ours. When we left the apartment for the last time, I stood in the doorway and looked back. Nothing moved. Nothing waited. The space looked like any other apartment. Neutral walls, scuffed floors, ordinary damage from ordinary living. It struck me then how easily someone else could move in and never know. How easily they could repaint, rearrange, forget. We stayed with Elise's sister for 3 weeks. Nora slept through the nights. No whispering. No wandering. No early waking with that attentive stillness. The red marks stopped appearing on her skin. She stopped flinching at quiet. But she also stopped talking about her imagination. The stuffed animals stayed on her bed untouched. She didn't assign them jobs. She didn't narrate their conversations. When Elise asked if she wanted to bring one into the living room, Nora shook her head. "They don't need to," she said. That answer followed me for days. We took Nora back to the doctor, then to another. Tests came back normal. The word stress was used often, carefully. Trauma was mentioned once, quietly, like a fragile object no one wanted to handle directly. We nodded and agreed and accepted pamphlets we never read. At night, Elise and I talked in whispers long after Nora fell asleep. "Do you think it's gone?" Elise asked once. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another household settling around us. "I don't think it works that way," I said finally. Elise turned toward me. "Then what do you think?" I chose my words carefully, because saying the wrong thing felt dangerous. "I think it was finished with us," I said. "With her?" Elise didn't respond. She rolled onto her side, her back to me, and pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. We moved again after that. A different neighborhood. A newer building. Bright hallways, wide windows, no vintage shops within walking distance. We threw away more than we kept. Elise insisted on new furniture, new dishes, new light fixtures. She said it mattered to start clean. I didn't argue. Nora adjusted quickly. Too quickly. She made friends. She laughed. She forgot routines she'd clung to before. Sometimes when I watched her play, I felt relief so sharp it hurt. But there were moments. Rare. Quiet. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Sometimes Nora would pause mid-step, her head tilting just slightly, like she was listening for something far away. When I asked what she heard, she always said the same thing. "Nothing," she said. And sometimes, late at night, when the apartment was quiet and Elise was asleep beside me, I would catch a faint scent in the air. Not perfume, not dust, something old, something patient. It never lasted long enough to prove it was real. It never came with sound or movement or shape. Just a suggestion, like a memory the walls couldn't quite forget. Nora never spoke to another doll. She never asked for one. When Elise suggested donating some old toys to make room, Nora helped without hesitation. She lined them up neatly, touching each one once before placing it in the box. "All done," she said when she finished, and closed the lid herself. I don't know what Clara was. I don't know who the lady was, or how long she had been waiting, or what she took with her when she left. I only know that my daughter was a door for a while. And something on the other side noticed. People like to believe that bad things announce themselves, that they break in, that they demand attention. Some don't. Some wait to be invited. Story 3. Every night at 2 a.m., he starts shouting. Introduction. I didn't notice the new neighbor the day he moved in. That's the kind of building it was. People came and went like packages. You caught a glimpse of a shoulder in the stairwell, heard cardboard scraping on concrete, smelled someone else's detergent for a week, and then the hallway went back to being a place you passed through without thinking. I lived alone on the 4th floor of a narrow, aging apartment block that sat behind a row of newer buildings. From the street, it looked almost deliberate, like an older tooth among clean white implants. The entrance door never fully shut unless you pulled it hard, and the intercom buzzed with a sound that made you hold it away from your ear. Inside, there was always a faint dampness in the air, a mineral smell from old plumbing and plaster that had absorbed decades of winters. My apartment was small but predictable. 1 bedroom, a living room that was also my workspace. A kitchenette that was always either too hot or too cold. You could hear the elevator cables if you listened for them, and you could hear neighbors if they were careless, but most of the time, it was manageable. The building had rules, written and unwritten. Don't leave trash in the hallway, don't slam doors, don't ask questions unless you have to. I'd been there 3 years, long enough to learn when the pipes liked to knock, how long the hot water lasted, which step on the stairwell squeaked if you tried to be quiet. The first time I became aware of him wasn't visual, it was sound. It was exactly 2 a.m., down to the minute, because I checked. I woke up the way you wake up when a noise reaches you before your mind has decided what it is. Eyes open, breath caught, muscles already tense. For a second I didn't know where I was. My room was dark except for the faint blue glow of the alarm clock and the dull smear of streetlight that leaked through the blinds. The air was still. I heard the refrigerator click in the kitchen. I heard my own pulse in my ears. And then, from the apartment next to mine, I heard shouting. Not a single outburst. Not the sharp snap of a couple's fight, or the muffled thud of someone dropping something. It was a voice that rose and fell in short, forceful bursts, as if the person was repeating the same sentence over and over, trying to make it stick. The words were indistinct through the wall, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, harsh, not quite rage and not quite panic, like something in between. I sat up slowly and listened. The wall between our bedrooms was thin enough that I usually heard only small things. A cough, a drawer sliding shut, the faint tinny music of a phone if someone forgot themselves. This was different. This was full-throated. The kind of sound you don't make unless you're alone or you don't care who hears. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then it stopped abruptly, like someone had hit a switch. I waited. My body stayed braced, my hands clenched into the sheets. I expected a door to slam, footsteps, another burst. Nothing. The building settled back into its old noises, a distant toilet flushing somewhere above, the elevator hum far below, the slow creak of a pipe cooling. I lay back down and told myself it was a late-night call, an argument with someone on speakerphone, a drunk friend, a sports game replayed at the wrong volume. People were messy. Sound carried. I fell back asleep eventually, but my sleep was shallow, threaded with that sense that something had reached through the wall and brushed my nervous system, leaving it vibrating. The next morning I left for work early and didn't think about it until I came home. In the late afternoon, the hallway smelled like fresh paint and dust, like someone had scraped the past off the walls. A small stack of flattened cardboard leaned against the neighbor's door. My neighbor's door, I realized, the one directly beside mine. The doormat that had been there before was gone. A new one lay in its place, plain black, like it hadn't decided what it wanted to be. I paused for a moment with my keys in my hand. I could hear movement inside, faint, like someone crossing a room. I waited for the door to open, for the polite, awkward exchange you have with someone new. A nod, a hello, a sentence about renovations or the elevator. Nothing happened. The sound stopped. I unlocked my own door and stepped inside, and the quiet in my apartment felt slightly different, less like privacy and more like a thin barrier. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, partly because I was tired, and partly because I wanted to prove to myself that the shouting was a one-off. I left a glass of water on the nightstand, turned my phone face down, and let the darkness settle. At 1:58 a.m., I woke up without knowing why. My eyes opened. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the reason to arrive. I listened. 2 minutes later, at exactly 2 a.m., the shouting began again. This time it wasn't just one voice. It was still mostly one man's voice, loud enough to carry the same way it had the night before, but underneath it I heard something else. Another sound that made my skin tighten. A thinner, higher pitch, not words, not crying. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor, then a sudden sharp impact, like a fist hitting a wall or a heavy object, dropped. The man's voice surged, faster, more clipped, as if he was responding to something in the room. I got out of bed. The floor was cold under my feet. I moved to the wall and pressed my ear against it, careful not to let my own breath make noise. The wallpaper on my side was slightly lifted at the seam, and the plaster beneath felt cool and grainy. The shouting continued for maybe half a minute. I caught fragments this time, syllables that sounded like commands, short, repeated. Again, the words weren't clear, but the cadence was. It was as if he was trying to control something that kept slipping, then it stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier, like the air had been compressed. I stood there for a long time, ear still against the wall, waiting for the follow-up noises that would make it easy. A door opening. Someone leaving. A phone call. Something that said, "This is a person having a normal kind of problem." Nothing. When I finally stepped back, my heart was beating too hard for how still I was. My mouth tasted metallic, like I'd been clenching my teeth. I went back to bed and stared at the dark until morning. The next day, I tried to bring it up with someone in a way that wouldn't make me sound like I was already imagining things. In the stairwell, I ran into Marta from the 3rd floor, carrying grocery bags that always looked too heavy for her thin arms. We had the kind of neighbor relationship that lived on small exchanges. Weather, repairs, the building manager. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, as casually as I could. Marta adjusted the bags in her hands. Her eyes flicked toward the wall, toward the row of doors that hid other lives. "The building is old," she said. "It makes noise." "I mean, voices," I said. "From next door." She looked at me for a beat too long, then shook her head once. "No," she said. "I sleep." And then she walked past me, her steps quick, as if she didn't want the conversation to stick to her. That was the first time I felt the shape of it. Not just a loud neighbor, but the sense that people didn't want to touch the subject, as if acknowledging it would make them responsible. That evening I saw him. I came home from work as the sky was turning the dull color it gets before rain. The hallway lights were on, buzzing faintly. I was fumbling for my keys when the neighbor's door opened. He stepped out carrying a small trash bag tied tight. He was taller than me by a few inches, lean in a way that didn't look athletic, so much as stretched. His hair was dark and cut close on the sides, longer on top, slightly damp as if he'd just washed it. His face looked tired, but not in the ordinary sleep-deprived way. His eyes were too alert, fixed, scanning. He saw me and paused. For a second, we stood in the hallway facing each other with the shared discomfort of strangers who live too close. I forced myself to nod. "Hi," I said. He nodded back, minimal. His gaze flicked to my door, then to my hands, then back to my face. "Evening," he said. His voice in the hallway was lower than what I'd heard through the wall, controlled. He didn't sound angry. He sounded careful, as if he measured the volume of every word. I waited for him to introduce himself. He didn't. He stepped past me toward the stairwell, the trash bag swinging lightly from his fingers. As he moved, I caught a smell that didn't match the hallway. Something sharp, chemical, like disinfectant or industrial cleaner. I watched him go, my keys still in my hand. When I went inside my apartment and shut the door, I realized my hand was shaking slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold air in the hall or something else. At 2 a.m. That night, he shouted again. By then I was awake before it started. I lay in bed with my eyes open, counting the minutes on the clock without wanting to. When the digits flipped, the sound hit the wall like a thrown object, voice rising, falling, breaking into harsh fragments. I didn't move. I listened as if listening could keep it contained. After the shouting stopped, I heard a different sound. A slow, steady thump, spaced like footsteps but heavier, as if someone was pacing with deliberate weight. It moved away from the shared wall, deeper into his apartment, then back again. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. It continued for several minutes, and then it stopped at the exact moment the building's old pipe in my bathroom made its own soft knock, as if the apartment had decided to imitate what it had heard. In the morning, I checked the building's notice board near the mailboxes. New tenants were supposed to register their names for deliveries. There was a fresh paper taped up, the handwriting neat and small. Apartment 4B, his apartment, had a name written beside it. It wasn't a name I recognized. It looked like it had been written carefully, almost deliberately, as if the person wanted it to be legible but not personal. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the ink, trying to decide if it meant anything. That was when I understood something simple and unpleasant. I was already rearranging my life around a voice I didn't know, a schedule I hadn't agreed to. And it was only the third night. The roster background, I wasn't new to apartment living. I knew the ordinary noises people made when they forgot they had neighbors. The late-night laughter that turned into a hissed shh, the thud of a dropped phone, the chair dragged back across tile because someone couldn't be bothered to lift it. I'd lived under a couple that fought in whispers and lived beside a guy who played bass at midnight like he was trying to prove something to the walls. I'd learned how to tune things out. I'd learned how to build a mental fence around my own space. That's why the precision of it bothered me more than the volume. It wasn't random. It wasn't occasional. It arrived at the same time every night like a scheduled event I hadn't been invited to. If it had been 1:47 one night and 3:10 another, I could have blamed stress or alcohol or insomnia. If it had happened once a week, I could have waited it out. But 2 a.m. made it feel intentional. It made it feel like a choice. My days started to orient around that number. I'd catch myself checking the clock at 1:30, then again at 1:50, pretending I was just making sure my alarm was set, pretending it didn't matter. On the nights I managed to fall asleep early, my sleep would thin out as it approached, like my body had learned the pattern even if my mind refused to admit it. I'd wake with my heart already running, my mouth dry, and lie there waiting in the dark as if I was bracing for impact. Outside those nights, my life stayed almost painfully normal. I worked in a small IT role for a logistics company, one of those jobs where you're always fixing something that isn't broken enough for anyone to respect it until it stops working completely. I spent most of my day looking at screens, answering tickets, walking between desks with a polite smile and a practiced patience. My coworkers knew me as quiet, reliable, the person who didn't overshare. I liked it that way. I'd learned a long time ago that the less you gave people, the less they could reshape into something else. When I got home, my routine was predictable. Shoes off by the door, keys in the bowl, kettle on, laptop open on the table. I ate simple meals standing at the counter. I watched the same kind of mindless shows with subtitles, so I wouldn't accidentally crank the volume. I kept my apartment clean in a way that was less about discipline and more about control. If everything had its place, then at least one part of my life stayed where I left it. The building itself contributed to that need for control. It was old enough to have quirks, but not old enough to be charming about them. The plaster in my hallway had been patched and repainted so many times that you could see faint ridges if the light hit it at an angle. The radiators clanked in winter, then went silent in spring with a sigh that sounded like relief. The mailboxes downstairs had names scratched into the metal from people who'd moved out years ago and never been replaced. The building manager, an exhausted man named Paolo, showed up only when something broke badly enough that tenants threatened to stop paying rent. Most people kept to themselves. On my floor, there were 5 apartments. Marta lived below me with her grown son, who was never seen. Across the hall, a couple who seemed to run their lives on whispered arguments and cigarette smoke. At the end of the corridor, an older man who smelled like cooking oil and never made eye contact. You could live there for years without learning anyone's name if you didn't want to. The hallway functioned like a shared tunnel, not a community. So when I saw the new neighbor in passing that evening, the lean man with the disinfectant smell and the careful voice, I realized I didn't even know what to call him in my mind. The guy next door was too casual. The new neighbor made him sound temporary. I started thinking of him by his schedule. 2 a.m. The strange part was that during the day, his apartment behaved like it was empty. No music. No television bleed. No footsteps. No shower running at odd hours. Nothing that suggested a person settling into a new space. It was as if he didn't exist between midnight and morning. Then, at night, he returned in the most intrusive way possible, not by slamming doors or throwing parties, but by filling the wall with his voice and then withdrawing completely. I started noticing other details. The smell in the hallway outside his door intensified sometimes, not like a normal cleaning product used once a week, but like something applied repeatedly. A sharp antiseptic bite that made my nose sting slightly, that clung to the air even after I stepped into my own apartment. Once, coming home from work, I noticed faint dampness on the floor right in front of his threshold, a narrow strip like someone had mopped only that section and nothing else. The doormat remained plain black. No personal touches. No plants. No umbrella stand. Nothing in the corridor that suggested a human life. It was like his door was the entrance to a place that hadn't decided to be lived in. On the fourth night, the shouting went longer. It started at 2 a.m. As usual, sharp bursts and urgent cadence. But this time it didn't stop after 20 seconds. It continued, rising and falling in a way that made it hard to tell if he was arguing with someone or reciting something. I pressed my face into my pillow to block it out, then gave up and sat up, my skin prickling. I heard another impact harder than before. Not a fist on a wall, something heavier. The kind of sound that makes you wince because it carries the implication of force. My first impulse was to call the police. My hand even went to my phone. And then I stopped because of what that would mean. Because of the questions. What's your emergency? What are they saying? Are you sure? Because of the way the building worked. How people watched each other through peepholes and then denied it later. Because I didn't want to be the person who overreacted to a neighbor having a breakdown and then had to live next to him afterward, knowing he knew it was me. So instead, I did the thing I'm still ashamed of. I listened. I pressed my ear to the wall and tried to catch words. I held my breath and focused on the gaps between his phrases. For brief moments, the syllables sharpened into something I could almost understand, but they slipped away again, blurred by plaster and distance. It sounded like he repeated the same short pattern again and again, like someone practicing a line until it sounded right. Then abruptly, there was silence. Not the usual silence that followed. This was deeper, like even the building had paused. I realized I was sweating slightly despite the cool air in my room. My t-shirt clung at the back of my neck. My hands felt numb. A few seconds later, I heard a sound that was almost worse than the shouting. A soft, slow scraping, as if furniture was being moved carefully across the floor, not dragged in anger. Adjusted, aligned. It went on for several minutes. Then, as if someone had checked a final measurement, it stopped. At 2:19 a.m., I heard the faint click of his door lock. One click, then another, like someone locking it twice. I got out of bed and walked to my own front door. I didn't turn on the hallway light. I didn't want to announce myself. I put my eye to the peephole. The corridor was empty. The overhead light made the floor shine slightly. His door was closed. No shadows. No movement. And yet I had the distinct sensation that if I opened my door, I would find something different than I expected on the other side. I didn't. I went back to bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling until the sky outside my blinds turned from black to the faint gray of early morning. The next day I tried a different approach. I wrote a note. It took me an embarrassingly long time to decide what to say, because anything direct sounded like an accusation, and anything polite sounded weak. I ended up with something bland, the kind of message you leave for someone who parks badly. Hi, I'm your neighbor next door. Just wanted to mention that there's been some loud noise at night around 2 a.m. Could you please keep it down? Thank you. I stared at it for a while, then folded it once and held it in my hand as if it might burn me. In the hallway, outside his door, the disinfectant smell was strong enough to make my eyes water slightly. I hesitated, then slid the note under the edge of his door. The paper disappeared into the darkness inside with a soft rasp. I stood there for a moment, listening for movement, for some sign that he'd noticed. Nothing. When I went back inside my apartment, my stomach churned like I'd done something risky. I kept imagining him opening the note, reading it, deciding what kind of neighbor I was. Someone who complained. Someone who watched. Someone who could be punished. That evening, when I came home from work, the note was back. It lay on my doormat, perfectly centered. No folds. No creases. Like it had been handled carefully. There was no writing on it. No response. No mark. Just my own words returned to me as if the entire exchange had been rejected. I picked it up, and my fingers tingled as if I'd touched something cold. That night, at 2 a.m., the shouting started on time. Only this time, the cadence was different. It sounded less like arguing and more like calling out. as if he expected someone to answer. BC. First irregularities. After the note came back, I stopped pretending this was just about noise. It wasn't that the shouting got louder. In some ways, it became more restrained, as if whatever was happening next door had adjusted itself to my awareness. The volume dipped just enough that I had to concentrate to hear it, that I had to lean into the wall or sit upright in bed instead of lying flat. It felt intentional, like the sound was testing how much effort I was willing to make. I started sleeping with one ear uncovered. It wasn't a conscious decision. I'd wake up with my blanket twisted oddly, one shoulder exposed to the cool air, my head turned toward the shared wall. My body learned the orientation on its own. Even on nights when I managed to fall asleep deeply, I woke moments before 2 a.m., my heart already racing, as if something inside me had been nudged awake. The shouting changed in texture. Before, it had been sharp and clipped, the kind of sound that suggests anger directed outward. Now it stretched longer, words drawn out, rising at the end of phrases the way questions do. I still couldn't make out what he was saying, but the emotional shape shifted. Less command, more insistence, like he was trying to get something's attention. Underneath it, intermittently, I heard another sound. Breathing, not loud, not labored, just present. A steady inhale and exhale that didn't sync with his voice. Sometimes it sounded close to the wall, other times farther away, like it moved around the room while he stayed fixed in one place. The first time I noticed it clearly, my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. I pressed my palm flat against the wall, feeling the faint vibration of sound travel through the plaster. The surface felt colder than the surrounding air. I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping it against my shirt as if I'd touched something unclean. During the day, my focus frayed. At work, I caught myself staring at lines of code without processing them, rereading the same email 3 times. Coffee stopped helping. My jaw ached from clenching without realizing it. When coworkers spoke to me, their voices sounded slightly delayed, like I was hearing them through water. I began to notice the time everywhere. Digital clocks, microwave displays, phone notifications. The number 2 followed me around the way a word does when you've just learned it and suddenly hear it in every sentence. I'd look up at 1:42 and feel my chest tighten. I'd see 1:55 and feel a cold anticipation settle in my gut. The building itself seemed to respond. The pipes knocked more often at night, sharp metallic taps that made me flinch. The hallway light outside my door flickered occasionally, dimming for half a second before stabilizing. Once, I woke up to find my bathroom door open when I was certain I'd closed it before bed. I told myself these were things I'd always lived with and was only now noticing because I was on edge. That explanation stopped working the morning I found the mark on my door. It wasn't obvious at first. Just a faint smear near the handle, slightly darker than the surrounding paint. I noticed it because I'm particular about my space. I wipe the door down once a week, out of habit more than necessity. When I ran my thumb over it, the surface felt tacky, not wet, but not fully dry either. It smelled faintly of the same disinfectant I'd noticed in the hallway. I scrubbed it with a cloth until the paint dulled, and my hand stung from friction. The smell lingered in the air afterward, thin and sharp, like it had sunk into the material rather than sitting on top of it. That night, when the shouting started, I didn't stay in bed. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, my phone face up beside me, the clock glowing in the darkness. From there, the sound came through the wall at an angle, distorted but clearer in rhythm. I focused on the pauses between his phrases, the way he seemed to wait after certain words. It felt like a call and response, except the response never came. At 2:07 a.m., I heard a knock. Not on my door. From his apartment. 3 slow taps, spaced evenly, coming from the other side of the wall, as if he was knocking on something inside his own space. After the 3rd knock, he spoke again, his voice lower, more controlled. Then came the breathing, closer now, louder, right up against the shared wall. I held my own breath, afraid that even that might somehow be heard. The next morning, I checked the hallway camera feed. The building had installed a cheap security system the previous year after a package theft. Tenants could access the footage through a shared app, though most of the cameras barely worked. I scrolled back to the timestamp from the night before, my fingers trembling slightly. At 2 a.m., the hallway outside our apartments was empty. No doors opened. No shadows passed. No movement at all. At 2:11 a.m., the feed glitched for 3 seconds, just static. Then the image snapped back. Nothing else. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, feeling a dull pressure build behind my eyes. When I finally closed the app, my reflection stared back at me from the dark phone screen, pale and drawn. That evening when I came home, something new waited for me. A sound. Not shouting. Whispering. It seeped through the wall softly, irregularly, like someone practicing words under their breath. It stopped the moment I unlocked my door. I stood there in the hallway, key still in the lock, my skin prickling. From the other side of the wall, I heard one last thing before silence settled. A soft exhale, right where my head would be if I leaned against the plaster. Escalating tension. After the whispering started, my apartment no longer felt like a place I returned to. It felt like a position I occupied. I began keeping the lights on at night, not all of them, just enough to break the darkness into manageable pieces. The lamp in the living room stayed on low. The kitchen light glowed faintly through the doorway. My bedroom remained dark, but the door stayed open so I could see the spill of light on the floor. I told myself it was practical, that it made sense if I needed to get up quickly, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to be alone in the dark with the wall. The shouting still came at 2 a.m., always on time, but now it felt directed. It no longer filled the space randomly. It seemed to orient itself toward the shared wall, as if he had moved whatever he was doing closer to me. The vibrations traveled through the plaster with a new clarity. I could feel them in the frame of my bed, in the metal legs of the table if I leaned my weight against it. Sometimes the shouting broke off mid-sentence, replaced by long stretches of silence that felt intentional, like pauses meant to test whether I would react. I would sit frozen, muscles tight, counting my breaths, waiting for it to resume. When it did, the relief was immediate and sickening. At least something was happening. At least the pattern was intact. The breathing returned more often. It no longer sounded like it belonged entirely to his voice. Sometimes it continued even when he wasn't speaking, slow and measured, close enough to suggest proximity but not position. I tried to map it in my head, distance, direction, but the sound refused to behave like something physical. It shifted without movement, grew louder without approaching. One night I heard him laugh. It was short, controlled, almost amused. It came right after a stretch of silence that had lasted long enough for me to relax slightly, to let my shoulders drop. The laugh snapped me back into tension instantly. It wasn't the kind of laughter you share with someone. It was the kind you release when something works. The next morning I found my door unlocked. I stood there with my hand on the knob, staring at it, trying to reconstruct the night before. I was meticulous about locking up. Always 2 turns of the key. Always the same order. Door closed, handle checked, lock turned. I even remembered the sound, the soft click of the mechanism settling. The door hadn't been opened. Nothing inside my apartment was disturbed. My laptop was where I'd left it. My wallet was on the counter. The windows were closed, but the lock sat in the neutral position, as if it had never been turned. I locked it again, slowly, deliberately, listening to each movement. The smell hit me as I did. That same sharp disinfectant scent drifted through the crack of the door from the hallway, stronger than before. It carried something underneath it now, something sour and organic, like damp fabric left too long in a closed space. My throat tightened reflexively. I didn't go to work that day. I called in sick, my voice steady enough to sound convincing. When I hung up, the apartment felt too quiet, like it was waiting. I moved through the rooms, checking corners, closets, the bathroom, even though I knew it was pointless. There was nowhere for anything to hide. And yet, the sense of being observed followed me, a pressure between my shoulder blades that didn't ease no matter where I stood. Around noon, there was a knock on my door. I froze. The knock came again, softer this time. I approached slowly, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I looked through the peephole. It was him. He stood in the hallway with his hands folded loosely in front of him, posture straight, expression neutral. Up close, he looked older than I'd thought at first. Lines around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that suggested chronic tension. His eyes met the peephole directly, as if he knew exactly where I was. I didn't open the door. After a few seconds, he spoke. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, "for the noise." The sound of it, so close and so normal, made my stomach twist. "I didn't realize the walls carried so much," he continued. "I'll be more careful." I swallowed, forcing myself to respond through the door. "Okay," I said. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. "Thank you." There was a pause. "I hope I didn't wake you," he added. I didn't answer. Another pause, longer this time. I imagined him standing there, listening, deciding what my silence meant. Finally, I heard him step back. His footsteps moved away toward the stairwell. I waited until they faded completely before exhaling. That night, there was no shouting. At 2 a.m., the clock changed and nothing happened. I lay in bed, wide awake, every nerve on edge. The absence of sound was worse than the noise. My mind filled the silence with possibilities. Had he stopped? Had something changed? Was this compliance or preparation? At 2:17 a.m., I heard a sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I stared at the dark, my body locked in place, my breath shallow. I heard the faint brush of fabric, the subtle shift of weight. Then very softly I heard him breathe. Not through the wall. Outside my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle screaming at me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. I listened as the breathing lingered for a long, unbearable moment. Then it moved away. The next morning, there were faint scuff marks on the floor outside my door, thin arcs in the dust that hadn't been there before. They curved toward the wall and stopped. That was when I realized something that made my chest feel hollow. He wasn't just next door anymore. He was mapping me. Walk, critical incident. The night it happened, the building was quieter than I'd ever known it. No elevator hum. No distant television bleed. No pipes knocking in complaint. Even the street outside seemed muted, as if the city had agreed to hold its breath. The silence felt intentional, pressed flat and deliberate, like a surface you weren't supposed to break. I'd stopped trying to sleep before 2 a.m. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed with my shoes on, my phone in my hand, the lights on low throughout the apartment. I'd packed a small bag earlier that evening, documents, charger, wallet, without fully admitting to myself why. It rested by the front door, zipped, waiting. At 1:59 a.m., my phone vibrated with a calendar notification I didn't remember setting. It simply said 2 o'clock. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering, my pulse hammering in my throat. Before I could dismiss it, the time changed. 2 a.m. There was no shouting. Instead, there was a knock. Not loud, not aggressive. 3 soft taps on my wall. The sound came from the exact spot where my head rested when I slept, precise enough that I flinched backward instinctively. My skin crawled, every hair on my arms lifting at once. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Another knock. This one slower. Deliberate. I stood up, my legs trembling, and backed away until I hit the kitchen counter. The knock came again, followed by something else. A low murmur, too quiet to be words, vibrating through the plaster like a voice pressed close. Then he spoke. "I know you're awake," he said. His voice didn't come through the wall the way it had before. It sounded closer, fuller, as if the wall itself was amplifying him. I could hear the shape of his mouth around the words, the controlled steadiness of his breath. "You've been listening," he continued. "Every night. You're very consistent." My mouth went dry. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the counter to stay upright. "I tried to be polite," he said, "but you needed a clearer pattern." The wall thumped once, hard enough to rattle a picture frame. "I needed you to understand the timing." I backed toward the door, each step slow, terrified that any sudden movement would change something. My bag waited there, absurdly ordinary. The lock turned on its own. I heard it clearly, the soft mechanical click from the other side of the door. My breath hitched painfully. I hadn't touched it. I was still 3 steps away. "I told you I'd be more careful," he said, almost kindly. I didn't say I'd stop. There was a sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Stopping directly outside my door. The pressure in the air changed. My ears popped faintly like an altitude shift. I could smell the disinfectant again, stronger than ever, layered over something warm and metallic. My phone buzzed violently in my hand. A notification from the building camera app. Motion detected, 4th floor hallway. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The door handle moved. Not turning. Testing. "I don't shout anymore," he said softly, "because now I don't need to." The handle moved again, just a fraction. My vision tunneled. I lunged forward, grabbing the deadbolt and slamming it shut, throwing my weight against the door as if my body alone could hold it. The metal rang sharply. On the other side, he laughed. Not loud. Satisfied. "You see," he said, "you're learning." Something scraped against the door, slow, vertical, like fingernails dragging down painted wood. The sound traveled straight through my spine. I bit down hard enough to taste blood. Then it stopped. The footsteps retreated. The hallway fell silent. I stayed pressed against the door for a long time, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. When I finally forced myself to look through the peephole, the corridor was empty. But the camera app still showed motion. Constant. Unbroken. Like something was standing just out of frame. Aftermath. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed pressed against the door until the shaking in my arms turned into a deep, aching numbness. My legs cramped from the unnatural angle, my back slick with sweat despite the cold air creeping up from the floor. Every few seconds I held my breath, listening for the return of footsteps, for the faint scrape of something testing the door again. Nothing came. That silence felt temporary, like a pause rather than an ending. When the sky outside my windows finally began to pale, the relief I expected didn't arrive. Morning didn't make the apartment feel safer. It only made everything sharper, more exposed. I checked the hallway camera feed again with shaking fingers. The footage from 2 a.m. showed exactly what I already knew and somehow hoped would be different. At 1:59:58, the hallway was empty. At 2:01, the image glitched, just a single frame, a flicker. When it stabilized, someone stood outside my door, not moving, not knocking, just standing there, slightly off-center, as if he'd positioned himself carefully. His face was angled away from the camera, but I recognized the shape of his shoulders immediately. The lean frame, the too-still posture. He stayed there for 19 minutes. At 2:19 a.m., he stepped backward, out of frame, and the hallway was empty again. No one else appeared. No doors opened. No lights turned on. I watched it 3 times before my hands went numb. I didn't shower. I didn't eat. I packed the rest of my things with mechanical efficiency, every sound in the apartment making me flinch. I kept expecting the lock to turn again, the handle to test itself while I stood there helpless. I jumped at every creak of the building, every distant door slam from another floor. When I finally opened my door, the hallway looked exactly the same as it always had. Neutral walls, scuffed floor, buzzing lights. But the smell lingered. That sharp disinfectant bite hung in the air outside my apartment, stronger near his door. I didn't look at it directly. I didn't want to give myself another image to replay later. I walked past quickly, keys clenched so tightly in my hand that the metal cut into my palm. I didn't tell the building manager what happened. I told him there had been ongoing disturbances, and that I needed to terminate my lease early for personal safety reasons. He looked tired, unsurprised. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He just nodded and slid the paperwork across the desk like he'd done this before. I stayed with a friend across town for a week. I slept on their couch, lights on, door locked. The first few nights, I still woke up at 1:58 a.m., automatically my heart racing, my body braced for a sound that never came. Even in a different building with different walls, my nervous system kept the schedule. 2 a.m. felt burned into me. I went back to the old apartment one last time to return the keys. The hallway on the 4th floor was quiet. His door was closed. The black doormat still lay perfectly centered. No name was listed on the mailbox anymore. Apartment 4B was blank, like it had never been occupied. I handed the keys to the manager and didn't look back. It's been months now. I live in a different part of the city, in a newer building with thicker walls and brighter hallways. I check locks twice, sometimes 3 times. I don't sleep with my bedroom door closed anymore. I keep lights on without realizing it. And every now and then, never every night, never predictably, I wake up just before 2 a.m. No noise follows, no shouting, no footsteps, just the sensation of being expected to listen.